Hello, and welcome to NightSleepWhisper. Tonight, we are uncovering an old mystery hidden on the tracks. Our journey is titled, The Secret of the Midnight Train. In this 50-chapter saga, we will explore the silence of the snowy mountains and the secrets tucked away in the shadows of a moving train. Now, lean back, close your eyes, and let the rhythm of the rails carry you away. Victor stood on the station platform. The night air was cold and a light fog covered the ground. He pulled his thick grey coat closer to his body. In his right hand, he held a small, leather suitcase. In front of him, the Midnight Express waited. It was a magnificent train with shiny black paint and silver lines. A thick cloud of steam rose from the heavy engine and disappeared into the dark winter sky. Victor was an older man with white hair and sharp, kind eyes. For 30 years, he worked as a detective in a large, busy city. He spent his life solving difficult crimes and catching dangerous people. Now, he was retired. He wanted a quiet life without any more trouble. He wanted to read his books, walk in the park, and drink warm tea. This trip was his gift to himself. He planned to travel across the snowy mountains of Europe and enjoy the silence. "Ticket, please, sir," a man said. It was the conductor. The man wore a neat blue uniform with bright gold buttons. Victor reached into his pocket and took out a small piece of white paper. The conductor looked at the ticket and smiled politely. "Welcome to the Midnight Express, Mr. Victor," the conductor said. "Your cabin is in the second carriage. Please, go inside. It is much warmer than the platform." Victor climbed the metal steps and entered the train. Inside, the hallway was beautiful and very expensive. The floor had a soft red carpet that felt good under his boots. The walls were made of dark, polished wood. Small lamps on the walls gave a warm, yellow light. The air smelled like rich coffee and old books. Victor felt a sense of peace. He thought this was the perfect place for a long rest. He walked down the narrow hallway. He found a door with a small silver number on it, number 4. He opened the door and stepped inside. The cabin was small but very comfortable. There was a soft bed, a small wooden table, and a large window. Victor placed his suitcase on the bed. He sat down by the window and looked out at the station. The platform was busy. Adult passengers were walking quickly, carrying heavy bags and wearing warm hats. Some people were talking and saying goodbye to their families. Victor watched them silently. He liked to observe people. It was an old habit from his days as a detective. Even though he was on holiday, his eyes still looked for small details. He noticed a tall man in a long black coat. The man looked around the station very quickly, as if he was worried. He held his bag tightly against his chest. He looked nervous. Victor watched the man board the train 2 carriages away. A moment later, the train began to move. It started slowly. The station platform began to slide away. The lights of the city became small, bright dots in the distance. Soon, there was only the dark forest and the white snow outside the window. Victor leaned his head against the glass. He was ready for a long, peaceful night. He did not know that his holiday was about to change forever. Victor felt a little hungry. He left his cabin and walked toward the dining car. The train moved steadily through the dark night. He could feel the gentle vibration of the floor under his feet. When he opened the heavy wooden doors of the dining car, he was surprised. The room was very bright and elegant. Tall candles stood on every table. The white tablecloths were perfectly clean and the silver forks shone under the lights. A steward in a white jacket walked toward him. "Good evening, sir. Would you like a table for one?" "Yes, please," Victor said. The steward led him to a small table in the center of the car. Victor sat down and looked around. The dining car was full of interesting people. At the table next to him, a woman with short dark hair sat alone. She wore a smart blue suit and glasses. She was reading a thick stack of papers and marking them with a black pen. She looked very focused. Further down the car, a tall man with a serious face sat with a small medical bag on the chair beside him. He had grey hair at his temples and wore a very expensive watch. He was drinking a glass of red wine and looking out at the dark trees passing by the window. Suddenly, a loud voice filled the room. A man with a large stomach and a red face entered. This was Mr. Henderson. He wore a suit that looked very new and expensive. Behind him followed a woman in a long fur coat and many gold necklaces. "I want the best wine and the best steak," Mr. Henderson told the waiter. He sat down heavily. The woman, Mrs. Gable, sat across from him. She looked at the other passengers with a small, proud smile. The steward brought Victor some hot tea and a plate of bread. Victor watched the other guests quietly. The woman with the papers looked up. She noticed Victor watching and gave a small nod. "Are you also traveling to the mountains?" she asked. Her voice was calm and professional. "Yes," Victor replied. "I am looking for some peace and quiet. My name is Victor." "I am Sarah," she said. "I am a lawyer. Peace is hard to find on this train, I think. Mr. Henderson over there makes a lot of noise." Victor smiled. "He seems very successful." "He is very rich," Sarah whispered. "He owns many factories. The man sitting alone is Dr. Aries. He is a famous surgeon. We have a very important group of people here tonight." Dr. Aries looked over at them but did not speak. He seemed tired. The atmosphere in the room was strange. On the surface, it was a luxury dinner. But Victor felt a secret tension. People were not just eating. They were watching each other. Mr. Henderson began to talk loudly about his business. Mrs. Gable laughed at his jokes, but her eyes did not look happy. Victor finished his tea and felt the cold wind against the window. The train was now high in the hills. The journey was just beginning, but Victor's old detective feelings were waking up. He felt that these people were all hiding something behind their expensive clothes. Victor watched the waiter bring a silver tray to Mr. Henderson's table. The rich man was still talking loudly. He was telling a long story about a big bank in London. Mrs. Gable nodded her head, and her gold earrings sparkled in the candlelight. Sarah went back to her papers, but her hand was shaking a little. The train moved faster now. It began to climb a steep hill. Outside the window, the white snow was bright under the moon. But then, the view changed. A huge stone wall appeared next to the glass. The train was entering a very long tunnel. Suddenly, the moonlight was gone. The only light came from the small lamps inside the dining car. "This tunnel is very long," Sarah said. She looked at the window. She could only see her own reflection in the dark glass. Then, something happened. The yellow lamps on the walls started to change. They became dim and then bright again. They flickered several times. The silver forks on the tables made a soft metallic sound as the train shook. The train felt like it was struggling to move forward. "What is wrong with the power?" Mr. Henderson shouted. He sounded very angry. "I am paying a lot of money for this trip. I want light." Dr. Aries stood up from his table. He held onto the back of his chair to stay steady. He looked up at the ceiling. The lamps flickered one last time and then stopped completely. The dining car was now in total darkness. Victor sat perfectly still. He could not see his own hands. The room was very quiet for a few seconds. Then, the silence broke. Victor heard the sound of a heavy glass falling on the floor. It broke into many small pieces. He heard a heavy chair move across the carpet. It made a long, scratching sound. "Stay calm, everyone," Victor said. His voice was loud and steady. "Do not move in the dark. It is dangerous to walk when you cannot see." I can't see anything. Where is my husband? Mrs. Gable cried out. Her voice came from the left side of the room. She sounded very afraid. Victor listened carefully. He was a trained detective, and his ears were sharp. He heard the heavy breathing of the other passengers. He also heard a different sound. It was the sound of a sliding door opening and closing very quickly at the end of the car. A cold wind from the hallway hit his face for a brief moment. James. Conductor. Come here. Mr. Henderson called out. His voice was muffled, as if he was far away. Then, there was a heavy thud, like something hitting the wall. The train continued to move through the tunnel. The engine made a deep, constant rhythm. Victor waited in the blackness. He kept his eyes open, but there was no light at all. He felt his heart beat a little faster. He knew that in the dark, many things could happen. He reached out his hand and touched the edge of his table. He wanted to make sure he knew where he was sitting. Is everyone okay? Sarah asked. Her voice was small and trembling. Nobody answered. The darkness was heavy and cold. Victor waited for the lights to return. The train finally moved out of the long tunnel. Bright white light from the moon and the snow filled the dining car again. The electric lamps on the walls flickered and then stayed on. The yellow light was warm, but the feeling in the room was very cold. Victor blinked his eyes. He looked around the room quickly. Sarah was still at her table. Her face was very pale, and she held her pen so tightly that her fingers were white. Dr. Aries was standing by his chair. He looked confused and held his medical bag against his chest. Then, Victor looked at the large table where the rich couple sat. Mrs. Gable was there. She was leaning back in her chair with her hands over her mouth. Her eyes were wide with terror. But the chair across from her was empty. Mr. Henderson was gone. He is not here. Mrs. Gable shouted. Her voice was high and thin. My husband. Where is he? Victor stood up immediately. He walked over to their table. He noticed several things at once. Mr. Henderson's heavy wooden chair was pushed far back from the table. On the floor, a crystal wine glass lay in many small, sharp pieces. A dark red liquid stained the white carpet. It looked like a dark shadow on the floor. Did you see him leave? Victor asked Mrs. Gable. He spoke in a calm, soft voice to help her feel safe. No, she whispered. She started to cry. It was so dark. I heard a noise. It was a heavy sound, like a person falling. I called his name, but he did not answer. When the lights came back, he was just gone. Sarah walked over to join them. She looked at the empty chair and then at the broken glass. How is this possible? The train is moving very fast. He cannot just disappear into the air. Dr. Aries stepped closer, too. He looked at the red stain on the carpet. He reached down and touched it with his finger. This is wine, he said quietly. It is not blood. That is good news, at least. Victor looked at the end of the dining car. There was a heavy door that led to the next carriage. He remembered the sound he heard in the dark, the sound of a sliding door opening and closing. He walked to the door and tried to turn the handle. It did not move. It is locked, Victor said. He turned back to the group. Did anyone see Mr. Henderson walk toward this door? Everyone shook their heads. They were all too scared during the darkness to see anything. At that moment, the door from the kitchen opened. James, the conductor, walked in. He looked tired. I'm very sorry about the lights, he started to say. The heavy snow caused a problem with the... He stopped speaking when he saw Mrs. Gable crying and the empty seat. He looked at Victor. Is something wrong, sir? Mr. Henderson is missing, Victor said. He disappeared while the lights were out. We need to find him now. James grew very pale. He looked at the locked door and then at the broken glass. The peaceful night on the Midnight Express was over. A man was gone, and the train was moving across a lonely mountain where no one could help them. James the conductor took a deep breath. He tried to look professional, but his hands were shaking. He pulled a small silver flashlight from his belt. The light was bright and white. It moved across the dark wood and the white cloth of the dining car. "We must search everywhere," James said. "The train is a closed space. He must be somewhere in this carriage or the next one." Victor nodded. He looked at the floor near Mr. Henderson's table. He walked slowly, looking at every detail. He did not want to miss a single clue. The other passengers stayed in their seats. They were quiet and watched Victor and James with worried eyes. Victor knelt down on the soft red carpet. He looked under the table where the rich man sat. Near the leg of the heavy wooden table, something caught the light. It was small and shiny. Victor reached out and picked it up. It was a pair of glasses. They had thin silver frames and very thick glass. One of the lenses had a small crack in the corner. "Are these your husband's glasses?" Victor asked. He held them up so Mrs. Gable could see. Mrs. Gable looked at them and started to cry again. "Yes," she whispered. "He always wears them. He cannot see anything without them. He never takes them off." Victor looked at the glasses closely. If Mr. Henderson left the room by choice, he would take his glasses. Finding them on the floor meant something different. It meant that Mr. Henderson was removed from his chair very quickly. Or, perhaps, he fell. Where could he go without his glasses? Sarah asked. She stood up and walked closer. "He is almost blind without them. He could not walk down the hallway alone." James moved his flashlight to the heavy door at the end of the car. "I told you, this door is locked. I have the only key." He reached into his pocket and showed a large brass key. "I locked it before we entered the tunnel because the next car is for storage. No one is allowed inside." Victor walked to the door again. He looked at the floor in front of it. There were no marks on the carpet. He looked at the handle. It was clean. Then, he looked at the window next to the door. The window was large and square. It was covered with a thin layer of frost from the cold mountain air. Victor used his hand to wipe the frost away. He looked out into the night. The train was moving past tall pine trees covered in white snow. Everything was dark and lonely. "James," Victor said, "is it possible for a man to exit the train while it is moving?" James shook his head quickly. "No, sir. The doors are very heavy. If a door opens, a loud alarm goes off in the driver's cabin. The driver did not stop the train, and no alarm happened." Victor looked at the cracked glasses in his hand. A man was gone. His glasses were on the floor. The doors were locked, and no alarms were heard. It was a mystery that did not make sense. Victor felt a small chill that was not from the cold wind. He knew that the danger was still inside the train with them. Victor looked at the heavy metal handle of the door that led to the storage carriage. He was not a detective anymore, but his mind still worked like one. He saw problems like puzzles. A man was missing from a moving train. This door was the only way forward. He looked at the lock. It was a large, old piece of metal. "James," Victor said, "you said you have the only key, but look at the lock carefully." James the conductor walked closer. He held his flashlight near the keyhole. Victor pointed to a small detail. There was a thin silver scratch on the metal. It looked new. "Someone used a tool here," Victor whispered. "Or perhaps another key." James looked worried. "That is impossible, sir. These keys are special. Only the train staff have them." My key is here in my pocket. He pulled out his heavy brass key again. Please, open the door, Victor said. We need to see what is on the other side. James put the key into the lock. He turned it. A sharp metallic sound came from inside the door. James pushed, but the door did not move. He pushed harder with his shoulder. The door stayed completely still. That is strange, James said. He was breathing heavily now. The lock is open, but the door is stuck. It feels like something heavy is leaning against it from the other side. Victor leaned his head against the cold wood of the door. He listened. He did not hear any voices or footsteps. He only heard the constant rhythm of the train wheels on the tracks. Then, he looked at the edges of the door. He noticed something small. James, look at the top of the door, Victor said. There was a small metal bolt at the very top. This bolt was not part of the main lock. It was a simple sliding lock, the kind people use on bathroom doors. It was pushed into the closed position. However, this bolt was on the other side of the door. The door is locked from the outside, Victor said. Someone went through this door and then locked it from the other side so we cannot follow. But how? Sarah asked. She was standing behind them now. Her voice was sharp and loud. If they locked it from the other side, they are still in the storage carriage. They are trapped. Victor turned to look at her. Sarah was holding her small black bag very tightly. Her knuckles were white. She looked at the door and then at Victor. Her eyes moved quickly, as if she was looking for an exit. Maybe they are not trapped, Victor said slowly. Maybe that is exactly where they want to be. Victor looked at the group. Dr. Aries was watching the door with a cold, blank expression. Mrs. Gable was still crying into a silk handkerchief. Everyone seemed like a victim. But Victor knew better. One of these people knew exactly why that door was locked. He looked back at the silver scratch on the lock. The mystery was growing, and the Midnight Express was moving deeper into the dark mountains. James stopped pushing the door. He was out of breath and his face was red. The group walked back to the center of the dining car. The bright lights felt too strong now. Every shadow on the wall looked like a hidden person. Victor sat down across from Sarah. He noticed she was not reading her papers anymore. Instead, she held a small black leather bag on her lap. Her arms were wrapped tightly around it. You seem very attached to that bag, Sarah, Victor said. He spoke softly and kept his hands on the table. Sarah looked up quickly. Her eyes were wide and nervous. She tried to smile, but it did not look real. It is just my legal documents, she said. Her voice was much faster than before. They are very important for my job. I cannot leave them alone. Victor watched her. The bag was small and rectangular. It did not look like it held many papers. It looked heavy. When Sarah moved her legs, the bag made a soft metallic sound. It was the sound of something hard hitting another hard object. It was not the sound of paper. Mr. Henderson was your client, correct? Victor asked. Yes, Sarah replied. She looked at the locked door of the next carriage and then back at Victor. I was helping him with a large business deal. That is all I can tell you. A lawyer must keep secrets. Did that deal involve something very valuable? Victor asked. He leaned forward a little. Sarah did not answer. She pulled the bag even closer to her chest. She looked at the other passengers. Dr. Aries was watching her from the corner of the room. He was not drinking his wine anymore. He was staring at the black bag with a sharp, cold look. Mrs. Gable was still crying, but she also looked at Sarah with a strange, suspicious expression. We are all in danger, Sarah said suddenly. She stood up. We should not be talking about bags. We should be looking for a way to stop the train and find Mr. Henderson. James told us the driver cannot stop the train here, Victor reminded her. The snow is too deep on these tracks. If we stop, we might get stuck in the cold forever. We must wait for the next station. Sarah shook her head. I am going back to my cabin, she said. I do not feel safe in this room anymore. She walked away quickly. She held the bag under her arm like a shield. Victor saw that she was looking behind her as she walked down the narrow hallway. She was afraid of the other passengers, or perhaps she was afraid of what she was carrying. Victor waited until she left the room. He felt that the black bag was a very important piece of the puzzle. He needed to know what was inside, but he had to be careful. On this train, a secret was more dangerous than the cold mountain wind. Victor stayed in the dining car after Sarah left. He did not go to his cabin. He felt that the dining car still held more secrets. James the conductor was cleaning up the broken glass on the floor. Mrs. Gable sat in a corner, looking out at the dark snow. Dr. Aries was silent, his eyes fixed on the locked storage door. Victor walked back to the window near the locked door. He remembered wiping the frost away earlier. He looked at the floor again. The carpet here was dark red, but there was a small piece of paper caught in the metal track of the window. It was very small, about the size of a postage stamp. Victor knelt down. He picked up the paper carefully. It was not white like his own ticket. This paper was a bright, deep blue. It was torn at the edges, as if someone had pulled it quickly. He turned the paper over in his hand. On one side, there were two printed letters. St. James, come here for a moment, Victor called out softly. The conductor walked over, holding his broom. Yes, Mr. Victor. Did you find something? Victor showed him the blue paper. What kind of ticket is this? My ticket is white. Sarah's papers were white too. James looked at the blue scrap. His face became very serious. He looked around the room to see if anyone was listening. This is not a passenger ticket, sir, he whispered. This is a staff ticket. It is for the people who work at the train stations. Specifically, for the storage staff who load the heavy boxes. Does anyone on this train have a blue ticket like this? Victor asked. Only me and the driver, James said. But my ticket is in my jacket pocket. And the driver is at the front of the train. He never leaves the engine. Victor looked at the blue paper again. So, if a staff member from a station boarded the train, they would have a ticket like this. Yes, James replied. But no staff boarded the train at the last stop. We only took on water and fuel. No people. Victor thought about the man in the black coat he saw at the station. That man looked nervous. He carried a heavy bag. Victor remembered the man's movements. He did not walk like a passenger looking for a seat. He walked like a man with a specific destination. James, Victor said, does the word St mean anything to you? It is printed here on the scrap. James shook his head. It could be many things. Station, storage, staff. It is hard to know from just two letters. Victor looked at Dr. Aries. The doctor was watching them closely. When Victor looked at him, Dr. Aries quickly turned his head away. He picked up his wine glass, but his hand was perfectly still. He was listening to every word. Victor put the blue scrap of paper into his pocket. He now had two clues, a pair of cracked glasses and a torn blue ticket. A man was missing, and a stranger might be hiding on the train. The Midnight Express felt smaller now, as if the walls were closing in. The train began to slow down. Victor felt the change in speed as the floor beneath his feet vibrated differently. Outside the window, the white snow was gone. It was replaced by a heavy, dark rain. The water hit the metal roof of the train with a constant, rhythmic sound. It sounded like thousands of tiny stones falling from the sky. The windows were covered in long lines of water, making it impossible to see the mountains anymore. Victor walked over to the table where Dr. Aries sat. The doctor was still looking at the locked door. His face was like a mask. It showed no emotion. Victor sat down in the chair across from him. He wanted to see how the doctor would react. "Dr. Aries," Victor said quietly, "you are a famous surgeon. You said you knew Mr. Henderson 20 years ago. Was he a healthy man back then?" Dr. Aries looked up. His eyes were sharp and very intelligent. He took a slow sip of his wine before answering. "Mr. Henderson was never a healthy man, Victor. He worked too hard and ate too much rich food. He had a very weak heart. In fact, he carried special medicine with him at all times." "A weak heart," Victor repeated. He thought about the empty chair and the broken glass. If he had a heart attack during the darkness, he could not have moved far. He would be on the floor near his table. "Exactly," Dr. Aries said. He leaned forward. And he certainly could not have opened a heavy door or climbed through a window. A man with his condition needs help to even walk up a flight of stairs. Victor watched the doctor's hands. Dr. Aries was wearing thin, black leather gloves. It was strange to wear gloves while drinking wine inside a warm dining car. "Why are you wearing gloves, doctor?" Victor asked. Dr. Aries did not move his hands. "I have a skin condition," he said shortly. "The cold mountain air makes it worse. Is that a problem for your investigation, Mr. Detective?" "I am just a passenger on holiday," Victor said with a small smile. "But I find it interesting that everyone on this train is hiding something. Sarah has her bag. Mrs. Gable has her grief. And you have your gloves." The train made a loud, screeching sound as it moved around a sharp corner. The rain was so loud now that it was hard to hear anything else. The train was moving much slower because of the weather. Victor looked at the floor near the doctor's feet. He saw the medical bag. It was made of dark brown leather. There was a small smear of mud on the side of the bag. It was fresh, wet mud. "The rain is making the tracks slippery," James the conductor called out from the end of the car. "We will be late reaching the next station. I must go and speak with the driver." James walked quickly out of the room. Now, only Victor, Dr. Aries, and the crying Mrs. Gable remained in the dining car. The atmosphere was heavy. Victor felt that the doctor was waiting for him to leave. He stood up and nodded to the doctor. "Enjoy your wine, Dr. Aries," Victor said. As Victor walked away, he looked back one last time. Dr. Aries was looking at the locked storage door again. The doctor's expression was no longer blank. He looked hungry, like a cat watching a bird. Victor stood alone by the large window at the end of the dining car. The rain was hitting the glass very hard now. The sound of the water was constant and heavy. He looked at the locked door leading to the storage carriage. If the door was locked from the other side, how did the person get there? He looked at the window frame. It was made of heavy, polished steel. Usually, these windows were sealed shut to keep the warm air inside and the cold mountain air out. He noticed a small silver lever near the bottom of the frame. It was hidden behind the edge of a thin velvet curtain. Victor moved the curtain to the side. The lever was small and did not look like the other fittings on the train. It looked like it was added later, or perhaps it was a secret feature for the staff. He reached out and touched the metal. It was freezing cold, as if it was connected to the outside world. He pushed the lever to the left. There was a sharp, metallic sound as the internal locks moved. Suddenly, the window shifted. It did not open like a normal window at home. Instead, it slid sideways, disappearing into a space inside the wall. Immediately, a blast of cold, wet air rushed into the dining car. The wind was strong and smelled like wet pine trees and iron. Rain splashed onto the expensive red carpet and onto Victor's face. He squinted his eyes against the storm and looked out into the dark night. He saw the side of the train. The black metal was shiny with rain. Just below the window, there were small metal steps and a thin handrail. These were used by workers to clean the windows or check the lights when the train was at a station. A person could stand on those steps and move along the side of the moving train. So, this is how they did it, Victor said to himself. He looked at the edge of the window frame very closely. He saw a small piece of blue thread caught on a sharp metal corner. It was the same bright blue color as the scrap of the staff ticket in his pocket. Someone wearing a blue uniform or carrying a blue bag had entered or exited through this window during the darkness of the tunnel. He realized that the locked door was a clever trick. The person did not need a key to get into the storage carriage. They just needed to step outside the train, move along the rail, and slide back in through another opening. But it was a very dangerous move. The train was moving fast, and the mountain rocks were very close. Only someone very brave, or someone who knew the train perfectly, would try it. Victor pulled the window back and pushed the lever to the right. The cold wind stopped, and the room became quiet again. He wiped the rain from his forehead with his sleeve. He felt a sense of urgency now. If someone could enter the train this way, no one was truly safe in their cabins. He thought about the people he had met. He thought about the muddy medical bag belonging to Dr. Aries. He thought about the man in the black coat he saw at the station. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to move, but the picture was still not clear. Mr. Victor. Victor turned around. It was James, the conductor. He looked even more pale than before. I spoke to the driver. He says we cannot reach the next station for another 2 hours. The tracks are too slippery from the rain. 2 hours is a long time, James, Victor said. In 2 hours, a person can go a long way, or hide a lot of things. Victor looked at the window one last time. The secret of the Midnight Express was more complex than he thought. It was not just a simple disappearance. It was a carefully planned act. The train moved slowly over the metal tracks. The sound of the rain was still heavy on the roof. Victor left the dining car and walked into the narrow hallway that led to the passenger cabins. The hallway was empty. The warm yellow light from the wall lamps cast long, thin shadows on the floor. Victor stopped suddenly. He looked down at the floor. In the middle of the beautiful red carpet, there was a dark, dirty mark. It was a footprint. Victor knelt down to look at it closely. The mud was dark brown and very wet. There were also small pieces of green pine needles mixed with the dirt. This was not the kind of dust you find inside a clean luxury train. This was the earth from the forest outside. This person was outside very recently, Victor whispered to himself. He touched the edge of the footprint with his finger. The mud was still soft. It had not dried yet. This meant the person walked here only a few minutes ago. Victor looked at the direction of the footprint. It pointed away from the dining car and toward the sleeping cabins at the back of the train. He stood up and followed the trail. There was another footprint 2 meters away, and then another one. They were large marks. These were not the shoes of a lady like Sarah or Mrs. Gable. These were heavy boots, the kind a worker or a traveler would wear in the mountains. Victor remembered the man in the black coat at the station. He remembered his heavy boots and his nervous eyes. Was that man moving through the train in the dark? As Victor followed the muddy path, he reached the door of cabin 6. The footprints stopped exactly in front of this door. There was a small smear of mud on the bottom of the white door, as if someone had pushed it open with their foot. Victor looked at the door. He did not know who stayed in cabin 6. He looked back down the hallway. It was still silent. He could hear the deep, constant rhythm of the engine, but no voices. He felt the cold air again. He realized there was a small draft coming from under the door of cabin 6. He remembered the secret lever and the sliding window in the dining car. Was there a similar window inside this cabin? If so, someone could enter the train through the window and walk directly into the hallway. Victor reached out his hand to knock on the door. His heart beat a little faster. He was a retired man, and he had no weapon. He only had his mind and his experience. Before his hand touched the wood, he heard a soft movement inside the room. It was the sound of a heavy object being dragged across the floor. Then, there was a click, like a lock turning. Victor did not knock. Instead, he stepped back into the shadows of a small corner. He waited. He wanted to see who would come out of that room. He watched the handle of cabin 6. It began to turn very slowly. The door opened just a few centimeters. A pair of eyes looked out into the hallway. The eyes were sharp and filled with fear. The door of cabin 6 opened a little more. Victor saw Sarah. Her face was very pale. She looked left and right into the empty hallway. When she saw Victor standing in the shadows, she gasped. She moved her hand to her chest. "Mr. Victor." "You scared me," she said in a low, shaking voice. "I saw the muddy footprints, Sarah," Victor said. He stepped forward into the light. "They led me straight to your door. Why is there mud in your cabin?" Sarah looked down at the floor and then back at Victor. She looked like she wanted to cry, but she stayed strong. She opened the door wider. "Please, come inside. We cannot talk in the hallway. People are watching." Victor entered the small room. It was similar to his own cabin, but it was messy. Papers were spread across the small table. The black leather bag was open on the bed. Inside the bag, Victor saw a heavy metal box with a digital lock. Sarah closed the door and locked it. She sat on the edge of the bed. "I was not outside," she said. "The footprints are not mine. But someone entered this room through the window while I was in the dining car. They were looking for this." She pointed to the black bag. "Who would do that?" Victor asked. "I don't know," Sarah replied. She looked at the window. It was closed now, but there was a small puddle of water on the floor beneath it. "But I know why they want it. I told you I was Mr. Henderson's lawyer, and that is true. But I am not just helping him with a normal business deal. We were working on a secret project." Victor sat in the small wooden chair. "What kind of project?" "Mr. Henderson found out that someone in his company was stealing millions of dollars," Sarah explained. She spoke quickly. "He spent months collecting evidence. He had names, dates, and bank accounts. All of that information is inside this metal box. We were traveling to the city to give this evidence to the High Court." Victor looked at the metal box. So, Mr. Henderson was in danger because of what he knew. "Yes," Sarah said. She gripped her hands together. "He was afraid. He thought someone was following him. That is why we took the Midnight Express. He thought a train would be safer than a plane or a car. He was wrong." "Does anyone else know about this project?" Victor asked. "Only his closest partners," Sarah said. She looked at the door. "And maybe someone on this train. I think the person who took Mr. Henderson is the same person who tried to steal this box tonight. They want to destroy the evidence." Victor thought about the other passengers. Dr. Aries, the quiet surgeon. Mrs. Gable, the mourning wife. The nervous man in the black coat. Any of them could be involved. "I need to keep this box safe, Victor," Sarah said. Her eyes were full of tears. "If they find me, they will take it. And then Mr. Henderson's work will be for nothing." Victor stood up. He felt a heavy responsibility. He was just a retired detective, but he could not let a crime happen in front of him. "I will help you, Sarah. But we must be very careful. On this train, we do not know who is a friend and who is an enemy." The train slowed down even more. The deep, constant sound of the engine changed to a low growl. Victor felt the floor tilt slightly as the wheels moved over a different set of tracks. Outside the window, the dark forest opened up. A small, lonely platform appeared in the middle of the mountains. There were 2 old wooden buildings and a single yellow light hanging from a tall pole. The light swung back and forth in the wind. "We are stopping," Sarah whispered. She looked at the window with hope in her eyes. "Maybe there are people here. Maybe we can get help and find Mr. Henderson." The Midnight Express came to a complete stop. The silence was very strange after the constant noise of the journey. Victor and Sarah left cabin 6 and went into the hallway. Other passengers were there, too. Dr. Aries stood by his door, his hands still hidden in his black leather gloves. Mrs. Gable was leaning against the wall. She looked very tired and her eyes were red from crying. James the conductor appeared at the end of the hallway. He was standing by the main exit door. He held a heavy metal bar across the handle. "Why are we stopping?" Dr. Aries asked. His voice was loud and sharp. "This is not a scheduled station. We should be moving." "The driver needs to check the engine," James said. He did not look at the passengers. He looked at his own boots. The heavy rain and the steep climb were difficult for the machinery. "We will be here for a short time." "I want to get off." Mrs. Gable cried. "My husband is missing. I want to talk to the police in this town." James shook his head slowly. "I am sorry, Mrs. Gable. I have strict orders from the driver. No one is allowed to leave the train. It is for your safety. The ground outside is very slippery and the forest is dangerous at night. There are no police in this small station. It is just a place for fuel and water." Victor walked to the window and wiped away the steam. The station looked empty. There were no cars and no people on the platform. The rain continued to fall, turning the white snow into a grey, wet mess. Then, Victor saw something move behind one of the wooden buildings. It was a tall shadow. The shadow was wearing a long, dark coat. "James," Victor said calmly. "Who lives at this station?" "Only the station master, sir," James replied. "But he is usually inside the building during storms like this." The shadow moved again. It was standing near the back of the train now. Victor realized the shadow was not moving toward the station building. It was moving toward the storage carriage, the car with the locked door. "Someone is outside," Victor said quietly to Sarah. Sarah gripped her black bag tighter. "Is it the person who was in my room?" "I don't know," Victor said. He watched the shadow disappear into the darkness near the metal tracks. But James said no one is allowed to get off. He did not say anything about people getting on. The yellow light on the station platform continued to swing. The rain was heavy, and it made a loud, rhythmic sound against the glass. Victor did not move from the window. He kept his eyes on the spot where the shadow disappeared. Suddenly, a flash of color moved between the trees at the edge of the forest. It was not a dark coat. It was a bright, deep red. A woman walked out from behind the wooden station building. She wore a long red coat and a matching hat. She moved slowly across the wet ground. The mud did not seem to bother her. She did not look like a worker or a person who lived in the mountains. Her clothes were elegant and expensive. She looked like she belonged in a grand hotel, not a lonely mountain station. "Look," Victor whispered to Sarah. He pointed his finger toward the tracks. Sarah leaned closer to the glass. Her breath made a small cloud of steam on the window. "Who is she? Is she a passenger from another carriage?" "No," Victor said. "I saw everyone who boarded the train at the main station. I do not remember a woman in a red coat. And James said no one is allowed to get off here." The woman stopped near the middle of the train. She looked up at the windows. For a brief second, the light from the platform hit her face. She was beautiful, but her expression was hard and cold. She held a small metal object in her hand. It looked like a tool or perhaps a key. She looked at the door of the dining car and then moved toward the storage carriage. "James!" Victor called out. The conductor hurried over. He looked out the window and his face went completely white. He looked like he had seen a ghost. "It cannot be," he whispered. "Who is she, James?" Victor asked. He watched the conductor's reaction carefully. James was not just surprised. He was terrified. I don't know, sir," James said, but his voice was shaking. "I have never seen her before. I must go and speak to the driver. This stop is taking too long." James turned and ran toward the front of the train. He did not use his flashlight this time. He moved quickly through the shadows. "He is lying," Sarah said. She looked at Victor. "He knows exactly who that woman is. Look at how he ran away." Victor watched the woman in red again. She reached the side of the storage carriage. She reached up and touched the metal handle of the door. She did not try to hide. She acted like she had every right to be there. Then, she looked directly at the window where Victor and Sarah were standing. She gave a small, slow smile. It was not a friendly smile. It was a warning. Then, the train made a deep, grinding sound. The engine started again. The heavy wheels began to turn slowly on the wet tracks. The woman in red did not move. She stood on the platform and watched the train slide away into the dark forest. "She didn't get on," Sarah said. "She just stood there. What was she doing?" "She was waiting," Victor said. "She was waiting for the train to stop. And I think she was checking if something, or someone, was still inside." Victor looked at the blue staff ticket in his pocket. He thought about the man in the black coat and the woman in the red coat. The pieces were moving, but the puzzle was getting bigger and more dangerous. The Midnight Express moved away from the lonely station. The rain continued to wash against the windows, and the sound was like a constant whisper. Victor left Sarah in the hallway and went back to his own room, cabin 4. He needed a quiet place to think about everything he had seen. The woman in the red coat, the nervous conductor, and the missing Mr. Henderson were all parts of a large, dark picture. Victor entered his cabin and locked the door behind him. He sat on the small, soft bed. The room was warm, but he felt a cold shiver. He looked around the small space. He had been in this room for hours, but now it felt different. It felt like the room was watching him. He remembered what Sarah said about the intruder in her cabin. If someone could enter her room through the window, they could enter his room too. Victor stood up and began to examine the walls and the floor. He moved his small suitcase and checked the corners of the rug. He knelt down on the floor and looked under the small wooden table. Everything seemed normal. Then, he looked at the heavy seat near the window. The seat was covered in thick blue velvet. Victor noticed that the velvet at the bottom of the seat was a little loose. He reached out and pulled the fabric. To his surprise, the bottom of the seat moved. It was not a solid piece of furniture. It was a lid. Victor used both hands to lift the heavy wooden board under the cushion. Inside the seat, there was a deep, dark space. It was a hidden compartment, built into the frame of the train car. "What is this?" Victor whispered to himself. The compartment was not empty. At the bottom, there was a small metal box, similar to the one Sarah had, but much older. Next to the box was a folded piece of white paper. Victor picked up the paper carefully. His hands were steady, but his heart was racing. He unfolded the paper. It was not a letter. It was a list of names. The names were written in neat, black ink. As Victor read the list, his eyes went wide. He saw Mr. Henderson at the top. Below that, He saw Dr. Aries and Sarah. But the last name on the list made him stop breathing for a second. The last name was his own. Victor. Next to each name, there was a small number. Next to his name, the number was 7. Victor looked at the list again. Why was his name there? He was just a retired detective on holiday. He did not know these people before today. Or did he? He looked at the metal box inside the compartment. He tried to lift it, but it was very heavy. It felt like it was filled with stones or metal bars. Before he could try to open it, he heard a sound in the hallway. It was the sound of heavy footsteps stopping right outside his door. Victor quickly pushed the wooden lid back down and covered it with the blue velvet. He sat on the seat and picked up a book from the table. He tried to look like a man who was just resting. The handle of his door turned slowly. Someone was trying to get in. Victor kept his hand on the book. He did not breathe. The door handle moved down and then up. It stayed in the middle for a moment. Then, the movement stopped. The person outside was standing perfectly still. Victor stood up slowly. He put the list of names into his deep coat pocket. He made sure the blue velvet cover on the seat was perfect. He checked the floor to ensure no dust was visible. Finally, he walked to the door and turned the lock. Dr. Aries was standing in the hallway. He still wore his black leather gloves. He looked at Victor with a strange, thin smile. "I saw the light under your door," the doctor said. His voice was low and smooth. "I thought you might be awake. It is a very long and difficult night, is it not?" "It is," Victor replied. He stood in the middle of the doorway. He did not want the doctor to see inside the room. "Is there a reason you are here at this hour, doctor?" "I thought you were resting in the dining car." Dr. Aries looked past Victor into the cabin. His sharp eyes moved to the seat by the window. Victor felt a cold sweat on his neck. "I am worried about the other passengers," the doctor said. "Mrs. Gable is very upset. And Sarah. Sarah is acting like she has a great secret. I thought a man of your experience might have some advice for us." Victor felt the paper in his pocket. It felt heavy, like a piece of lead. He remembered his name on that list. Why was a retired detective part of this group? "I think everyone is just tired and afraid," Victor said. He tried to keep his voice steady. "We should all stay in our rooms until we reach the next station. That is the safest way." "Perhaps," Dr. Aries said. He leaned a little closer. The smell of expensive tobacco followed him. "But some rooms are safer than others. Did you know that cabin 4 was once used by a famous collector many years ago? People say the train was built with many hidden places for his treasures. Some people look for those places even today." Victor's heart beat faster. Did the doctor know about the compartment under the seat? "I did not know that," Victor said. He kept his face like a mask. "I only see a small bed and a table. It is a very normal, simple room." Dr. Aries laughed softly. It was a cold sound that had no joy in it. "Nothing on the Midnight Express is normal, Victor. Remember that. We are all on a list, one way or another. We are all part of the journey." Victor froze. "What list are you talking about, doctor?" The doctor did not answer. He turned around and walked back toward the dining car. His footsteps were silent on the thick red carpet. Victor watched him until he disappeared around the corner. He went back inside his cabin and locked the door with a double turn. He took the list out of his pocket and looked at the names again. Henderson, Aries, Sarah, and Victor. The number next to his name was 7. He looked at the metal box still hidden under the seat. He was too afraid to open it now. He realized he needed to find cabin 7. If the number was a clue, the answer to this mystery was waiting for him in that room. He sat on his bed and waited for the morning light, but the mountain night was still very dark. Victor did not go to cabin 7 immediately. He felt that Dr. Aries was still watching the hallway. Instead, he decided to return to the dining car. He needed to speak with the doctor again. He needed to know why their names were on a secret list. The train was still moving slowly through the heavy rain. The sound of the water against the metal roof was like a constant, low drum. When Victor entered the dining car, he found Dr. Aries sitting at the same table. The doctor was not drinking wine anymore. He was holding a small, old photograph in his gloved hands. He looked at it with a very sad expression. Victor sat down across from him. He did not say anything at first. He waited for the doctor to speak. "You want to know about the past, don't you, Victor?" Dr. Aries said without looking up. "The list in my room has your name and mine," Victor said. "It also has the name of Mr. Henderson. It says you knew him 20 years ago." Dr. Aries sighed and placed the photograph on the table. It was a picture of 3 young men standing in front of a large, beautiful building. "We were friends once," the doctor said. "Mr. Henderson, myself, and a third man. We were young and we wanted to be rich. We worked for a company that moved art and gold across the borders." Victor looked at the photo. "And what happened?" "We made a mistake," Dr. Aries whispered. 20 years ago, a very famous painting disappeared from a museum in Paris. The police looked for it for a long time. They never found it. Mr. Henderson was the driver of the transport truck. I was the person who checked the security. We were part of the crime, Victor." Victor was shocked. He looked at the doctor's calm face. So, Mr. Henderson was not just a businessman. He was a thief. "He was a smart man," Dr. Aries replied. "He used the money from that crime to start his factories. He became rich and famous. He tried to forget the past. But I could not forget. And the third man went to prison because of us." "Who was the third man?" Victor asked. Dr. Aries looked toward the locked storage door. "His name does not matter now. What matters is that he is free. He came out of prison last year. He wants his share of the money. He wants revenge." "Is he on this train?" Victor asked. He thought about the man in the black coat and the woman in the red coat. "I think so," the doctor said. He put the photograph back into his pocket. "That is why the list exists. Someone is counting the people from the past. Someone is checking us off, one by one. Mr. Henderson was the first. I am likely the second." Victor felt a chill. "But why is my name on that list? I was not there 20 years ago. I was a detective in the city." Dr. Aries looked Victor in the eyes. "Because you were the detective who caught the third man, Victor. You are the reason he went to prison. He has not forgotten you, either." Victor walked slowly down the hallway. His mind was full of thoughts about the past. He remembered the case from 20 years ago. He remembered a man with angry eyes and a hard face. At that time, Victor did not know that the man was connected to Mr. Henderson and Dr. Aries. He thought it was just a simple robbery. Now, everything was different. He was not a young detective with a badge and a gun anymore. He was an old man in a small cabin on a dark train. He entered cabin 4 and turned the lock. He sat on the edge of the bed. The only light came from a small, yellow lamp on the wall. Outside, the rain was still very heavy. A loud sound of thunder echoed through the mountains, and the glass in his window shook. The train felt small and weak against the power of the storm. Suddenly, the light on the wall flickered. It became very bright for 1 second, and then it died. The whole train became completely dark. The constant sound of the engine changed to a low, quiet hum. Victor sat in the blackness. He could not see his own hands. He waited for his eyes to adapt to the dark, but there was no light from the moon tonight. The world outside was as black as the world inside. Then, he heard a sound. It was very close. It was a soft, metallic scratching sound. Someone was right outside his door. They were touching the lock with a piece of metal. Victor did not move. He held his breath and listened. He heard the door handle move down slowly. The person was trying to open the door without making a noise. The handle moved again, more quickly this time. The person began to push against the wood. The door was strong, but the lock made a small, stressed sound. Victor stood up quietly. He did not have a weapon, so he reached for the heavy book on his small table. He held it tightly with both hands. He was ready to protect himself if the door opened. "Who is there?" Victor asked. His voice was firm and loud. There was no answer. The scratching sound stopped immediately. For a long minute, there was only the sound of the rain hitting the roof. Then, Victor heard footsteps moving away. They were heavy, slow footsteps. They moved toward the back of the train, in the direction of the storage carriage. Victor waited for 5 minutes in the dark. His heart was beating fast. Finally, he used his hands to find the lock in the darkness. He turned it and opened the door just a few centimeters. The hallway was a long, black tunnel. He could not see any people, but he felt a very cold wind on his face. This wind was coming from the end of the hallway. He realized that the heavy door to the next carriage was now open. Someone was moving through the train in the dark, and they were looking for something, or someone. Victor stayed near the door for a long time. The train was still dark, and the only sounds were the heavy rain and the wind. He waited until his breathing became slow and calm. Finally, the lamps on the wall flickered. They stayed dim for a moment and then became bright again. The power was back. Victor sighed with relief. He closed his door and locked it once more. He felt very tired. His head was heavy with many questions about the list of names and the man from the past. He walked to his small bed. He wanted to sit down and think. As he reached for the pillow to move it, his hand touched something hard and cold. It was hidden underneath the white fabric of the pillow. Victor pulled the pillow away quickly. There, lying on the dark blue sheet, was a large metal key. It was made of heavy iron and felt very cold. It looked very old, like the keys used for the large storage rooms or the heavy doors of the engine car. Attached to the key by a thin wire was a small, round metal tag. Victor picked up the key and held it close to the lamp. On the metal tag, there was a single number. It was the number 7. Victor's hand began to shake slightly. He remembered the secret list he found in the hidden compartment under the seat. His own name was at the bottom of the list, and next to it was the number 7. Now, he held a key with that exact number. It was not a coincidence. Someone had entered his room during the darkness and left this key for him to find. Was it a gift, or was it a trap? Victor did not know. He thought about cabin 7. James the conductor had mentioned earlier that cabin 7 was supposed to be empty for this trip. It was at the very end of the carriage, right next to the locked storage door. He looked at the key again. It was a bit dirty, and there was a small smell of oil on it. This was not a normal cabin key. Passenger keys were usually made of shiny brass and were much smaller. This key looked like it belonged to a heavy, industrial lock. Victor stood up. He could not stay in his room anymore. The secret of the Midnight Express was calling him. He put the iron key into his pocket, next to the list of names and the blue ticket scrap. He felt the weight of the objects. Each clue was a piece of a story that started 20 years ago, and he was now in the center of it. He walked to the door. He knew he had to find James. He could not go to cabin 7 alone. It was too dangerous. He needed someone who knew the layout of the train. He opened the door and looked into the hallway. The long red carpet looked like a road leading into the unknown. Victor walked quickly toward the front of the train. He found James the conductor in the small staff room near the kitchen. James was sitting on a wooden stool, drinking a cup of dark coffee. He looked very tired. His eyes were red, and his blue uniform was a little messy. When he saw Victor, he stood up immediately. "Mr. Victor," James said, "you should be resting. It is very late." "I cannot rest, James," Victor said. He took the heavy iron key out of his pocket and placed it on the table. "I found this under my pillow. It has the number 7 on it. Does this key belong to the train staff?" James looked at the key and gasped. He did not pick it up. He looked at it like it was a dangerous animal. "This is an old master key," he whispered. "We do not use these anymore. They were used many years ago for the special cabins and the heavy storage boxes. I thought they were all locked in the driver's safe. Someone put it in my room during the darkness." Victor said, "We need to go to cabin 7. You told me it was empty, but I think someone is using it." James hesitated. He looked at the kitchen door and then back at Victor. "Cabin 7 is at the very end of the carriage, near the storage car. It is a cold and lonely room. No one has stayed there for months." "Then we have nothing to fear," Victor said firmly. "Please, bring your flashlight. We must see what is inside." They walked together down the long hallway. The train was very quiet now. Most of the passengers were in their rooms, and the lights were dim. The only sound was the constant rhythm of the wheels on the tracks and the rain hitting the windows. As they walked, the air became colder. They reached the very end of the hallway. The door to cabin 7 was different from the others. It was made of thick, dark oak wood and had no window. James held his flashlight. The white light hit the silver number 7 on the door. Victor reached out and put the iron key into the lock. It was a perfect fit. He turned the key slowly. A sharp metallic sound echoed in the quiet hallway. The lock opened. Victor pushed the door. It was very heavy and moved slowly. A long, low sound came from the hinges as the wood moved across the carpet. A blast of freezing air hit them. The smell inside the room was strange. It did not smell like a bedroom. It smelled like old dust, dry paper, and oil. James moved his flashlight around the room. The beam of light moved across the walls and the floor. Victor's eyes went wide. The room was not empty. There was no bed and no table. Instead, the small cabin was filled from floor to ceiling with large, rectangular objects. They were covered in thick, grey blankets and tied with heavy ropes. "What are these?" James asked. His voice was shaking. Victor walked to the nearest object. He pulled the corner of a grey blanket. Underneath, there was a beautiful gold frame. It was a painting. He looked at the other objects. There were dozens of them. "These are the stolen paintings from the museum," Victor said quietly. "The secret of the Midnight Express is not just a disappearance. This train is a moving treasure chest." The light from the flashlight moved slowly across the small room. It touched the sharp edges of the gold frames. Victor felt a chill in his heart. The paintings were beautiful and very old, but they represented a dark secret. He walked deeper into the cabin. It was hard to move because there were so many boxes and blankets on the floor. "I cannot believe this," James said. His voice was a low whisper. "I walk past this door every day. I thought the room was empty. How did they bring all of this on the train without me seeing them?" "They did not bring it on today," Victor replied. He touched a piece of thick rope. "This was planned for a long time. These paintings were stolen from a museum in Paris many years ago. I remember the news. It was one of the largest thefts in history. The world thought they were gone forever. Victor looked at a large painting near the window. It showed a woman sitting in a garden. The colors were still bright and beautiful. He looked at the small metal tag on the frame. It had a museum number and a date from many years ago. This was the work that Dr. Aries talked about during dinner. This was the reason for the list and the secret project. Why are these on the Midnight Express? James asked. And where is Mr. Henderson? Does he know about these paintings? I think Mr. Henderson was trying to return them. Victor said. He remembered the metal box in Sarah's room. Sarah told me they had evidence. Perhaps the evidence was about the people who stole these paintings 20 years ago. They are moving the art across the border on this train because it is a luxury express. Usually, the guards at the border do not check the storage of a famous train. Suddenly, the train moved over a rough part of the track. The whole carriage shook. A heavy box near the wall tipped over. It fell to the floor with a loud, heavy sound. James jumped back in fear. His flashlight hit the wall, and the light danced across the ceiling. In the corner of the room, behind a stack of grey blankets, Victor saw something else. It was not a painting. It was a black leather bag. It looked exactly like the one Sarah was carrying in her cabin. Victor reached for it. He wanted to see if it held more clues about the missing businessman. Wait. James said suddenly. He held up his hand. Did you hear that? Victor stopped moving. He listened carefully. The rain was still hitting the metal roof, but there was a different sound now. It was the sound of a heavy door sliding open in the hallway. Then, they heard the sound of slow, heavy footsteps. The footsteps were coming toward cabin 7. Turn off the light. Victor whispered. James pushed the button on his flashlight. The room became completely black. Victor and James stood perfectly still. They did not breathe. They were surrounded by millions of dollars of stolen art, and someone was coming to find them in the dark. In the thick darkness of cabin 7, Victor felt the vibration of the train against his back. He stood perfectly still next to a stack of wrapped paintings. Beside him, he could hear James the conductor breathing quickly. The footsteps in the hallway stopped right outside the door. There was a long silence. Victor's hand found the heavy iron key in his pocket. He held it tightly, ready to use it as a weapon if necessary. The door handle moved slightly, but the door did not open. After a few seconds, the footsteps began to move again. They did not go back toward the dining car. Instead, they moved further down the hallway, toward the storage carriage. Victor waited until the sound was gone. Is he gone? James whispered. His voice was so low Victor could barely hear it. I think so. Victor replied. But we cannot stay here forever. We need more light. But we must be careful. James turned on his flashlight again, but he kept the beam low toward the floor. Victor knelt down next to the black bag he had seen earlier. He opened it carefully. Inside, there was no money or jewelry. Instead, there was a stack of train schedules and maps. These were not normal maps for passengers. They showed secret routes, cargo areas, and border crossing points where the security was low. Victor looked at one of the schedules. It was for the Midnight Express, but it had handwritten notes in the margins. Next to the date of tonight's journey, someone had written, "Delivery at the bridge. Midnight." This is not just a simple robbery, Victor said, his voice serious. This is a business. These paintings are being moved across the border tonight. The Midnight Express is the perfect vehicle. It is fast, and the guards always trust it. He looked at the maps again. He realized that cabin 7 was chosen for a reason. It was the last cabin before the storage car. It was the most private area of the train. The paintings were hidden here, and the delivery would happen somewhere on the tracks. But who is the leader? James asked. Is it the man from the past? The one you sent to prison? It could be, Victor said. But he would need help. He would need someone on the train to move these heavy boxes and someone to open the doors. He would need a partner. Victor looked at James. The conductor looked truly afraid. But was he telling the truth? Victor also thought about Dr. Aries and his medical bag with the mud on it. And Sarah, with her secret metal box of evidence. Everyone had a reason to be suspicious. We need to find Mr. Henderson, Victor said. If he is the one who wanted to stop this, he's the only person who knows the full truth. He might be hidden in the storage carriage. Victor stood up and looked at the mountain of stolen art. The scale of the crime was huge. These paintings were worth millions, and people were willing to kill to keep them. He felt a heavy weight in his chest. He came on this train for a holiday, but now he was in the middle of a war between thieves. He took a deep breath and looked at James. Let's go, Victor said. We have to find out what is behind that locked door at the end of the hall. Victor and James walked back through the cold hallway. They moved silently, like shadows. Victor felt the weight of the iron key in his pocket. He also felt the weight of the secret they just discovered. The Midnight Express was not just a train. It was a gallery of stolen history. They reached the dining car and entered quietly. The room was almost empty now. The candles on the tables were low, and the light was soft. Dr. Aries was gone. Mrs. Gable was gone. Only Sarah was still there, sitting in a far corner with her head resting on her hands. She looked exhausted. James went back to the kitchen to check on the staff. Victor walked to his usual table and sat down. He wanted to think about his next move. As he sat, he noticed something strange. His dinner plate, which was clean and empty, was not straight. It was tilted to one side. Victor remembered that the steward always kept the tables perfect. He reached out and lifted the heavy ceramic plate. Underneath the plate, there was a small, square piece of white paper. It was not a train ticket or a list. It was a note. The words were not written with a pen. They were made of letters cut from a newspaper and glued to the paper. The message was short and clear. Stop looking. Victor felt a cold pulse of fear. He looked around the room quickly. Was someone watching him right now? The windows were dark, reflecting only the dim light of the dining car. Sarah did not look up. The kitchen door was closed. Victor picked up the note. The glue was still a little bit wet. This meant the person had placed the note under his plate very recently, perhaps while he and James were in cabin 7. This person knew that Victor was investigating. They knew he was looking for clues. Is something wrong, Mr. Victor? Victor looked up. It was the steward. He was carrying a fresh pot of coffee. The steward's face was kind, but his eyes were tired. Who was in the dining car while I was away? Victor asked. He kept the note hidden in his hand. Only the lady, Sarah. The steward replied, pointing to the corner. And Dr. Aries was here for a few minutes. He said he needed some fresh air and went toward the back of the train. Why do you ask, sir? No reason, Victor said. I was just wondering where everyone went. The steward nodded and walked away. Victor looked at Sarah. Was she the one? She had the secret box and the motive to protect Mr. Henderson's work. Or was it Dr. Aries? He had the history and the connection to the past. Or maybe it was the mysterious man in the black coat he saw at the station. Victor realized he was no longer a hunter. He was also the hunted. The note was a warning, but it was also a sign of weakness. The thieves were afraid of him. They were afraid an old detective might ruin their master plan. He stood up and walked over to Sarah. He decided it was time to be honest. If they were going to survive the night and find Mr. Henderson, they needed to work together. He sat across from her and placed the note on the table between them. "We are in more danger than you think, Sarah," Victor said. Sarah looked at the note. Her eyes became wide, and she pulled her black bag closer. "They are watching us, Victor," she whispered. "I told you this train was not safe. We should stay in the dining car where the lights are bright." Victor shook his head. "We cannot stay here. If we wait, they will finish their plan. We need to find Mr. Henderson, and we need to do it together. It is too dangerous for anyone to be alone now." Victor stood up and called for James the conductor. He also went to find Dr. Aries and Mrs. Gable. A few minutes later, the small group gathered in the middle of the dining car. Everyone looked tired and nervous. Mrs. Gable was pale, and she held a silk handkerchief tightly. Dr. Aries stood with his arms crossed, his black gloves still on his hands. "Listen to me," Victor said to the group. "We have found stolen paintings in cabin 7. We believe Mr. Henderson was trying to stop a crime. Now, he is missing. We think he is in the storage area at the back of the train." "The storage area?" Mrs. Gable asked. "But James said that door is locked." "It is locked," James said, holding his heavy brass key. "But Mr. Victor has an old master key. We are going to go there together. No one stays behind." The group walked slowly toward the end of the train. The air became colder as they moved away from the warm dining car. They passed the dark door of cabin 7. Finally, they reached the heavy metal door of the storage carriage. This was the baggage area where the large trunks and boxes were kept. It was under the main floor of the train, reached by a small set of metal stairs. Victor used the iron key. The lock moved with a heavy, metallic sound. He pushed the door open. A cold wind blew out from the darkness. It smelled like old iron and wet wood. James held his flashlight high. The light showed a long room filled with tall stacks of luggage and wooden crates. "Is he here?" Mrs. Gable called out. "Arthur, are you here?" Her voice moved through the quiet room, but there was no answer. The only sound was the constant rhythm of the train wheels on the tracks below them. The floor was made of cold metal, and it vibrated under their boots. "We must search every corner," Victor said. "Stay close to each other. Do not go behind the boxes alone." They began to walk through the narrow paths between the luggage. The shadows were long and dark. Every time the train turned a corner, the heavy boxes shifted slightly, making a low, grinding sound against the floor. Victor felt a strange feeling in his chest. He felt like they were walking into a trap. He looked back at the door they just entered. It was wide open, but the darkness behind it looked like a deep hole. The storage carriage was a maze of tall wooden crates and heavy leather trunks. The only light came from the flashlight in James's hand. The beam of light moved across the dusty surfaces. It created long, dancing shadows on the metal walls. The air here was much colder than in the rest of the train. Victor could see his own breath in the air. Every few seconds, the train hit a bump on the tracks. This caused the luggage to shift and groan like a living thing. "Arthur! Arthur, are you here?" Mrs. Gable called out again. Her voice was thin and full of fear. She stayed very close to Victor. "Wait," Sarah said. She pointed to a small wooden box near the center of the car. "Look at that." Victor walked over and looked at the floor. Lying on the cold metal was a silk scarf. It was dark blue with white stripes. Mrs. Gable gasped and picked it up. She held it to her face. "This belongs to my husband," she cried. "He was wearing this tonight. He must be here." Victor looked at the scarf and then at the crates around them. The path between the luggage was very narrow. He felt a strange sensation, like someone was watching them from the shadows. He turned his head quickly, but he saw only the dark corners of the carriage. Dr. Aries was standing behind them. He was looking at the ceiling, his face calm and unreadable. "This place is a cage," Dr. Aries said quietly. "We should not have come here all together." Suddenly, a strong, icy wind blew through the carriage. It was so cold that Sarah shivered and wrapped her arms around her chest. The wind came from the open door at the front of the car. Then, they heard a heavy movement. It was not the sound of the luggage shifting. It was the sound of metal moving against metal. A heavy metallic noise echoed across the room as the big door shut. The sound was deep and final. James ran toward the door, his flashlight waving wildly. He grabbed the handle and pulled with all his strength. The door did not move. He tried to push it, but it was stuck. He used his brass key in the lock, but the key would not turn. "It is locked from the outside," James shouted. He began to hit the door with his fist. "Someone locked us in. Is there another way out?" Sarah asked. Her voice was rising in panic. Victor joined James at the door. He looked at the edges of the metal frame. There was no gap. The person outside had used a heavy bar or a separate lock to trap them. They were now in a cold, dark room with no windows. The Midnight Express was still moving fast, carrying them deeper into the mountains. Victor looked at the group. The light from the flashlight was growing weak. "We are trapped," he said. "The person who took Mr. Henderson now has all of us in one place. We must find a way out before the temperature drops too low." The air inside the storage carriage turned freezing. Victor could see his own breath in the dim, fading light of James's flashlight. The train was climbing higher into the heart of the snowy mountains. Outside, the wind howled against the metal sides of the carriage. Every few minutes, the temperature seemed to drop more. Mrs. Gable was shivering uncontrollably, her silk scarf doing little to protect her from the biting cold. "We cannot stay here," Victor said, his teeth almost chattering. "If we do not get out soon, the cold will be more dangerous than the thieves." James moved the light around the ceiling. The storage car was a heavy metal box with no windows. The walls were thick and solid. However, near the very top of the rear wall, Victor spotted something. It was a small, square opening covered by a metal grate. It was a ventilation shaft, designed to let air move through the carriage. "There," Victor pointed. "James, can you help me reach that vent?" James looked at the height of the opening. It was nearly 3 meters above the floor. "It is very high, sir, and it is very small. I do not think a man of your size can fit." "I have to try," Victor replied firmly. "It is the only way out of this room." Dr. Aries stepped forward. "I will help. James, if you stand on that heavy wooden crate, and I stand next to you, we can lift Mr. Victor up. He is the only one with the experience to know what to do on the other side." James pushed a large, sturdy luggage crate against the wall. He climbed onto it, followed by the doctor. Victor stepped up onto the crate between them. He felt the train lean as it moved around a sharp mounting curve. He reached up, his fingers touching the cold metal of the ventilation grate. The grate was held in place by 4 small screws. Victor did not have a screwdriver, but he used the edge of the heavy iron key he found earlier. He turned the screws slowly. One by one, They fell to the floor, making a small metallic sound on the metal plates. Finally, the grate came loose. Victor handed it down to Sarah. A blast of icy air and snow hit Victor in the face. The vent led directly to the space between the carriages. He could see the dark, snowy mountains and the blurry shapes of trees passing by. The space was very narrow and filled with the smell of smoke and oil. "I'm going through," Victor called down. He pulled himself up using his arms. It was a difficult climb for a man of his age, but the fear of the cold gave him strength. He squeezed his shoulders through the small square opening. He felt the rough metal scratch his coat. With a final push, he slid his body into the dark, narrow shaft. "Wait for me to open the door from the outside," Victor shouted back to the group. He began to crawl through the metal tunnel. It was cramped and dark, but he could feel the movement of the train beneath him. He was moving toward the passage that connected the storage car to the rest of the train. He knew that the person who locked them in was likely still nearby. He had to be silent. He had to be quick. The lives of everyone on the Midnight Express depended on him. Victor dropped out of the ventilation shaft and landed on the cold metal platform between the two carriages. The wind was a loud roar in his ears, and the freezing rain soaked his hair immediately. He held onto the metal handrail tightly as the train shook. To his left was the heavy door of the storage car. To his right was the door to the rest of the train. He looked at the storage car door. A long metal bar was pushed through the handles from this side. That was why James could not open it with his key. Victor pulled the bar out. It was heavy and freezing cold. He pushed the door open just a little and called out, "It is open. Come out quickly." One by one, James, Sarah, Dr. Aries, and Mrs. Gable stepped out onto the platform. They were shivering, and their faces were blue from the cold. They moved quickly into the next carriage, where the air was warm again. James closed the door and locked it from the inside. They all stood in the hallway for a moment, breathing deeply. "Thank you, Victor," Sarah whispered. She was still holding her black bag. Victor did not go back to the dining car immediately. He noticed a small, metal trash bin near the conductor's small desk in the hallway. Something caught his eye. It was a dark leather notebook, sticking out from under some paper. He reached down and picked it up. The leather was wet, but the book was still in good condition. He opened the first page. It was not a diary of a worker. It was a private notebook belonging to Mr. Henderson. Victor began to read the notes as the group walked back toward the lights of the dining car. The notes were not about business deals or factories. They were about the Midnight Express itself. Victor learned a shocking secret. The company that owned the train was losing a lot of money. They were in deep debt. Mr. Henderson wrote that he was the secret owner of the train line. He was using his own money to keep the train moving, but it was not enough. "This is strange," Victor said to himself. He read further. Mr. Henderson wrote that he was worried about a betrayal. He thought someone close to him was helping the art thieves to use the train for their crimes. He wrote that the stolen paintings in Cabin 7 were his last chance to save the company. He wanted to return them to the museum to get a large reward. With that reward money, he could pay the train's debts and save his business. Victor stopped walking. He realized that Mr. Henderson was not just a victim or a thief. He was a desperate man trying to save his legacy. But who was the person he feared? Who was the traitor on the train? He looked at the people walking in front of him. James the conductor, who knew every corner of the train. Dr. Aries, the old friend with a criminal past. Sarah, the lawyer who knew all the secrets. Any of them could be the person Mr. Henderson was afraid of. Victor put the notebook into his pocket. He had a new piece of the puzzle, and it made everyone look even more suspicious. Victor sat at a small table in the corner of the dining car. He used a dry white cloth to wipe the rain from his face. The group was quiet. Sarah was drinking hot water with shaking hands. James was checking the locks on the dining car doors again. Dr. Aries sat alone at another table, staring at the floor. Victor took the leather notebook from his pocket. He opened it to the middle pages where the paper was still dry. The handwriting was messy and large. It showed that Mr. Henderson was very stressed when he wrote these words. The pages were full of numbers, dates, and bank names. Victor saw a long list of debts. The Midnight Express train line owed millions of dollars to a large bank in London. If the money was not paid by the end of the month, the bank would take the trains and the company would disappear. He was desperate. Victor whispered to himself. He read the next page. It was a draft of a letter that was never sent. It was addressed to the director of a famous museum in Paris. The letter said, "I have found the collection. I am bringing it to you on the Midnight Express. Please have the reward money ready at the final station. It is the only way to save my name and my business." Victor realized the truth. The paintings in Cabin 7 were not just stolen art. They were Mr. Henderson's only hope. He did not steal them himself 20 years ago, but he found them recently. He kept them secret so he could return them for a massive legal reward. With that money, he could pay the train line's debts. But there was a final note at the bottom of the page. It was written in red ink. It said, "Someone on my staff knows about the paintings. They do not want the reward. They want to sell the art on the black market for much more money. I cannot trust the blue uniform. I am being watched." Victor looked at James. The conductor wore a neat blue uniform. Every worker on the train wore a blue uniform. Was Mr. Henderson talking about James? Or was there another worker hiding in the shadows? Dr. Aries stood up and walked over to Victor's table. "What are you reading so carefully, Victor?" the doctor asked. His voice was smooth but cold. Victor closed the notebook quickly and put it in his lap. "Just some notes about the journey, Doctor. I like to write down my thoughts." "You are a very curious man," Dr. Aries said. He sat down across from Victor without being asked. "Curiosity is a dangerous thing on a train like this. Sometimes it is better to look at the scenery and say nothing." "The scenery is only dark mountains and rain," Victor replied, looking the doctor in the eyes. "There is nothing to see outside. All the interesting things are happening inside these metal walls." Dr. Aries reached out and touched the edge of the notebook with a gloved finger. "Is that Arthur's book? I recognize the leather. He carried it everywhere." Victor did not move. He was worried about money. "Doctor, did you know he was losing his company?" Dr. Aries sighed and looked at the ceiling. Arthur was always a big dreamer. He wanted the best of everything. But dreams are expensive. If he was in trouble, he should have asked his old friends for help. Maybe he didn't know who his friends were. Victor said. The train began to turn again. The lights flickered once, casting long shadows across the doctor's face. Victor felt the weight of the book. He knew the traitor was sitting very close to him. Victor felt the rhythm of the train change. The wheels were no longer hitting the tracks with a steady rhythm. Instead, there was a hollow, echoing ring. The train was crossing the iron bridge, a massive structure that spanned a deep mountain gorge. Below them, a freezing river rushed over sharp rocks, hundreds of meters down. Victor looked at his watch. It was 11:50 p.m. In 10 minutes, it would be midnight. He remembered the note. Delivery at the bridge. Midnight. "James," Victor said, his voice sharp. "How long does it take to cross this bridge?" James looked at his own pocket watch. His hand was trembling. "About 15 minutes, sir. It is the longest bridge in the mountains. We have to move slowly because of the wind." Victor stood up. He felt a sudden surge of adrenaline. If a delivery was going to happen, it had to happen now, while the train was over the gorge. He looked at the blue uniform of the conductor. He remembered Henderson's warning. "I need to see the staff quarters." Victor commanded. "Sir, passengers are not allowed." James started, but Victor was already moving toward the small door behind the kitchen. The staff quarters were cramped and smelled of grease and stale coffee. There were small lockers along the wall. Most were locked, but one near the end was slightly open. A corner of a bright blue jacket was hanging out. Victor pulled the door open. Inside the locker, he didn't find a uniform. He found a radio transmitter. It was a modern, high-powered device, blinking with a small green light. Next to it was a heavy pair of wire cutters and a map of the iron bridge. A specific spot on the map was circled in red. Pillar 4. "Who owns this locker?" Victor turned to James, who had followed him. James looked horrified. That is the locker for the night steward. But he didn't come to work today. He was replaced at the last minute by a man from the station staff. "The man in the black coat," Victor whispered. Suddenly, a loud, metallic sound came from the rear of the train. It sounded like a heavy bolt being thrown back. The floor of the train tilted sharply to the left. "The coupling!" James screamed. "Someone is trying to unhook the storage carriage." Victor realized the plan. The thieves didn't want to carry the heavy paintings off the train. They were going to disconnect the storage car while the train was on the bridge. The car would stop on the tracks, and a helicopter or a team on the bridge could take the art at their leisure, leaving the rest of the train to continue into the night. "We have to stop them," Victor shouted. He ran back through the dining car, past a shocked Sarah and a frozen Dr. Aries. He reached the end of the carriage. Through the glass window of the rear door, he saw a figure standing on the narrow metal platform between the dining car and the storage car. The man was wearing a blue staff jacket over a black sweater. He was holding a heavy iron bar, hammering at the connector that held the train together. The man turned around. It was the stranger from the station. He looked at Victor and smiled, a cold, predatory look. In his other hand, he held a remote detonator. Victor threw open the heavy rear door. The wind at the center of the iron bridge was a screaming monster, pulling at his clothes and freezing his skin. He stepped onto the shaking metal platform. Below him, between the gap of the two carriages, he could see the dark, jagged rocks of the gorge and the white foam of the river far below. "Miller!" Victor shouted over the roar of the wind. The man in the blue jacket froze. He looked at Victor, his eyes narrowing. "You remembered my name. Detective. I wasn't sure you would after 20 years. I never forget the men I send to prison." Victor replied, his voice steady despite the swaying of the train. "The art, the train, the disappearance. This was all for your revenge, wasn't it?" Miller laughed, a harsh sound lost in the gale. "Revenge is a luxury. Victor, I wanted the paintings. Henderson was just an obstacle. He thought he could play hero and return the collection. I couldn't let that happen. The Midnight Express is my ticket to a new life." In his right hand, Miller held the detonator. His thumb hovered over the red button. "The coupling is already loose. A small charge will blow the pin, and this carriage will stop dead on the bridge. My friends are waiting at Pillar 4 with a crane. By the time you reach the next station, the art will be gone, and I'll be a ghost." "And what about Henderson?" Victor asked, stepping an inch closer. Miller grinned, showing yellow teeth. "He's inside the storage car, tied up behind the crates. If you let the car go, he might live. If you fight me, he'll be at the bottom of that river." Suddenly, the train lurched. The wind caught the storage car, and the gap between the two carriages widened. The metal teeth of the connector groaned as they began to slip. "Don't do it, Miller." Victor lunged forward. Miller pressed the button. A sharp, white flash erupted between the cars. The sound was like a thunderclap. The heavy iron coupling snapped like a dry twig. Immediately, the storage carriage began to slow down, separated from the rest of the train. Victor felt the dining car beneath him surge forward, suddenly lighter. But Victor didn't stay on the dining car. At the moment of the explosion, he jumped. He landed hard on the metal floor of the retreating storage car. His fingers clawed at the cold metal plates as the gap between the two halves of the train grew. He looked back and saw James and Sarah through the glass door of the dining car, their faces filled with horror as the main train sped away into the darkness, leaving Victor and Miller alone on the slowing carriage, high above the abyss. Miller turned, his face twisted in rage. He hadn't expected Victor to jump. He raised the heavy iron bar. "You should have stayed on the train, old man. Now, there's no one to save you." The storage carriage coasted slowly across the iron bridge, its wheels squealing against the cold tracks. Without the engine to pull it, the heavy car was losing speed, but the wind was still pushing it toward the center of the gorge. Miller stood at the edge of the platform, the iron bar raised high. His face was a mask of cold hatred. 20 years in a stone cell. Victor. Miller screamed over the wind. 20 years of thinking about the man who put me there. I didn't just want the paintings. I wanted to see you fall. Miller swung the heavy bar. Victor dived to the left, his shoulder hitting the hard metal wall of the carriage. The bar struck the frame with a shower of sparks. Victor felt the vibration through the floor. He was older now, and his joints ached in the cold, but his mind was still sharp. He reached into his pocket and gripped the heavy iron key. It wasn't a sword, but it was solid metal. Miller lunged again. This time, Victor didn't move away. He stepped into the blow, catching Miller's arm and using the man's own momentum against him. They crashed into the side railing. Below them, the river was a hungry, white streak in the dark. "The paintings won't save you, Miller," Victor hissed, pressing the edge of the iron key against Miller's wrist. "The police are already waiting at the next station. James has the radio." "Liar," Miller growled. He kicked Victor's leg, sending the detective to his knees. Miller raised the bar for a final, crushing blow. "There are no police in these mountains." Suddenly, a bright light cut through the darkness. It didn't come from the train. It came from Pillar 4. A massive searchlight on the bridge structure turned on, blinding both men. From the darkness of the bridge's iron beams, 2 men in black climbing gear descended on ropes. "The delivery is here." Miller laughed, coughing. "Get the crates. Forget the old man." But the men on the ropes weren't moving toward the crates. They landed on the platform and ignored Miller. One of them held a badge up to the light. "Police. Drop the weapon." Miller froze. His jaw dropped. "What?" "No. The plan, the radio." Victor sat back against the wall, breathing hard. He looked at the officers. "You took your time," he said, a small smile touching his lips. "We've been tracking this shipment since Paris, Mr. Victor," the lead officer said, cuffing a stunned Miller. "We needed the thieves to reveal the hidden compartment before we moved in. Your holiday turned out to be quite productive for us." Victor stood up slowly, leaning on the railing. He looked toward the door of the storage car. Henderson. His inside. We need to get to him." The officers used their tools to force the jammed door. Inside, behind the stacks of stolen masterpieces, they found Arthur Henderson. He was tied to a chair, pale and shivering, but alive. He looked up as the light hit his face, his eyes filling with tears of relief. "The paintings," Henderson whispered, his voice cracking. "Are they safe?" "They are, Arthur," Victor said, stepping into the warm light of the carriage. "And so are you." Victor's breath hitched in the cold air as he knelt beside Arthur Henderson. The man's hands were raw from the rope, and his eyes were bloodshot, reflecting the trauma of the last few hours. Around them, the police officers moved with clinical efficiency, tagging the crates that held millions of dollars in stolen history. The storage car, once a silent vault, now felt like a tomb that had been reopened to the light of truth. Victor offered Henderson a canteen of water he had taken from the night steward's locker. Henderson drank greedily, the water spilling down his chin. "I thought it was over, Victor," he rasped, his voice barely a whisper against the wind that still whistled through the open door. "I thought Miller would push the car off the bridge just to see me die." Victor patted the man's shoulder, feeling the thinness of his frame. Henderson had been a giant in the business world, but here, in the dark heart of the mountains, he was just a vulnerable man who had tried to do the right thing far too late. The sound of a heavy engine echoed through the gorge. The dining car and the rest of the Midnight Express were returning. James had managed to signal the driver to reverse the train to recover the lost carriage. The massive metal buffers hit with a jarring clang that shook the entire bridge. Workers jumped down to begin the arduous process of recoupling the cars. In the distance, the first light of dawn began to touch the peaks of the mountains, turning the grey snow into a pale, ghostly blue. Sarah ran across the platform as soon as it was safe, her face streaked with tears. She threw her arms around Henderson, ignoring the mud and the grease on his coat. "We thought we'd lost you, Arthur," she sobbed. Henderson held her, but his gaze remained fixed on Victor. There was a question in his eyes, a silent, heavy question about the list of names. Dr. Aries stayed back, standing near the door of the dining car. He didn't come to congratulate Henderson. He watched the police lead Miller away in heavy chains. Miller looked back at Aries once, his expression unreadable, a flicker of something that wasn't quite hatred but more like a shared secret. Victor noticed the exchange. The third man had been caught, but the web of the crime seemed to have more strands than just Miller's revenge. As the carriage was finally secured and the train began to move forward again, Victor stood by the window. The iron bridge was behind them now, a dark skeleton against the morning sky. The emergency was over, but the mystery was not. The list of names in Victor's pocket still had numbers. His was 7. Henderson was 1. Miller was 6. But where were the others? And who was the person who had cut the letters for the warning note? Victor knew that the woman in red he had seen at the station was still out there, somewhere in the mountains or perhaps still hidden on the train. As the train resumed its steady rhythm, the atmosphere in the dining car shifted from terror to a heavy, exhausted silence. The police officers had taken Miller to a separate, guarded compartment at the front of the train. Arthur Henderson was wrapped in a thick wool blanket, sitting by the heater while Sarah rubbed his hands to bring back the warmth. Victor, however, could not rest. His mind kept returning to the delivery note and the radio transmitter he had found in the locker. If Miller was the one working the tracks, who was the one coordinating from the inside? Miller was a thief and a brute, but the technical precision of the plan, the bypass of the security locks and the manipulation of the train schedule, required someone with a different set of skills. Victor returned to the storage car, which was now guarded by a lone officer. "I need to check the crates again," Victor said, showing his retired detective's credentials. The officer nodded, stepping aside. Victor didn't look at the paintings this time. Instead, He looked at the floorboards near where Henderson had been tied. He noticed a small, silver pen lying under a heavy trunk. He picked it up. It was an expensive fountain pen, the kind used by surgeons or high-level executives. He turned it over in the light and saw the initials, A.A., engraved on the cap. Victor felt a cold stone settle in his stomach. Aries. Dr. Aries had claimed he was just a passenger and an old friend. But his pen was here, in the middle of a crime scene he supposedly hadn't entered. Victor then turned his attention to a small, unassuming wooden box that Miller had been using as a stool. It wasn't a crate for art. It was a personal footlocker. Victor pried it open with a metal tool. Inside, he found a second ledger. This one wasn't written by Henderson. It was a logbook of payments. It listed names of museum curators, border guards, and even several high-ranking officials in the railway company. Next to the payments were dates and locations. This was a map of a criminal empire that had been operating for 2 decades. The Midnight Express hadn't just been used once. It had been a regular pipeline for stolen goods for years. The most shocking discovery was at the very back of the ledger. There was a list of assets on the train. It listed the night steward, the backup driver, and someone referred to only as the Red Queen. Victor remembered the woman in the red coat at the station. She wasn't just a witness. She was the director of this entire operation. Miller was just her muscle. Victor realized that the threat wasn't over just because Miller was in chains. The Red Queen was still at large, and if she was as powerful as the ledger suggested, she wouldn't let her assets or her paintings be taken so easily. He closed the ledger and tucked it into his coat, his eyes darting toward the shadows of the carriage. Victor found Dr. Aries in the library car, a small, quiet space filled with leather-bound books and the smell of old paper. The doctor was standing by the window, watching the sunrise illuminate the valley below. He didn't turn around when Victor entered. The train tracks seemed louder here, a constant reminder that they were still moving toward a destination that felt increasingly uncertain. Victor walked up to the table and placed the silver fountain pen on the green felt surface. The metal glinted in the morning light, a silent accusation between the two men. "You dropped this, Doctor," Victor said, his voice as cold as the mountain air. "It was in the storage car, right next to the chair where Arthur was tied up. I didn't see you go in there during the search." Dr. Aries didn't flinch. He slowly turned around, his face as calm as a frozen lake. He looked at the pen and then at Victor. "I went in earlier, Victor, before the lights went out. I was looking for Arthur. I didn't tell you because I didn't want to be a suspect. In my profession, reputation is everything. Being found near a kidnapping and a hoard of stolen art is bad for business." "Is it also bad for business to be on a list of criminals who robbed a museum 20 years ago?" Victor asked, pulling out the ledger he had found in the storage car. Miller talked. "He told me about the 3 of you, but he also mentioned a 4th person. A woman. He called her the Red Queen. He said she was the one who kept the secret for 20 years. Was it your skin condition that required those black gloves, Doctor? Or were you hiding something else? Perhaps the marks of someone who has been handling industrial chemicals used to preserve stolen canvases." Dr. Aries took a slow breath. He reached out and picked up the pen, tucking it back into his pocket. "You are very good, Victor. Better than I remembered. But you are making a mistake. I am not the Red Queen's partner. I am her prisoner, just like Arthur was. She has been blackmailing me for years. Every time I perform a surgery, a portion of my fee goes to her. If I didn't help Miller get the codes for the train's decoupling system, she would have sent the evidence of my past to the police decades ago." "Where is she?" Victor demanded. "She isn't on the train," Aries said, his voice trembling slightly for the first time. "She was at the station to ensure the delivery happened. But she has eyes and ears everywhere. Even now, Someone on this train is reporting to her. You think you've won because Miller is in chains. But the game is much larger than one carriage. She wants that ledger, Victor. And she will kill anyone who has it. Suddenly, the train's whistle blew a long, mournful blast. They were approaching a tunnel, the longest one on the route. When the lights go out this time. Aries whispered, "Don't trust the shadows." The train plunged into the mouth of the mountain. The transition from the pale, snowy dawn to the absolute blackness of the tunnel was instantaneous and jarring. The roar of the engine amplified, echoing off the narrow stone walls until the sound was a physical weight pressing against the ears. Inside the library car, the dim emergency lights flickered and then died completely, leaving Victor and Dr. Aries in a void. Victor immediately pressed his back against the mahogany bookshelves, his hand instinctively gripping the heavy ledger tucked inside his coat. He could hear the doctor's shallow breathing just a few feet away, a rhythmic, nervous sound that stood out against the mechanical thrum of the train. "Stay where you are, Aries," Victor warned, his voice projecting a confidence he didn't entirely feel. He reached into his pocket for his matches, but before he could strike one, a cold draft hit his face. It wasn't the draft from the ventilation. It was the distinct feeling of a door opening nearby. A soft, gloved hand brushed against his arm, and Victor lunged forward, swinging his arm in the dark. He felt his fist connect with something solid, a shoulder or a chest, followed by a muffled grunt. The struggle was brief but intense. In the darkness, he couldn't tell if it was the doctor or an intruder. A heavy object struck the floor, and then the sound of retreating footsteps. Victor finally managed to strike a match. The small, orange flame illuminated a circle of chaos. Dr. Aries was slumped in his chair, his hands over his face, appearing dazed. The door to the hallway was swinging shut. Victor checked his coat. The ledger was still there, but his pocket had been sliced open with a precision that chilled him. The thief hadn't wanted the book. They had been looking for something else. He looked down at the floor and saw a small, ivory chess piece lying where the struggle had occurred. It was a queen, stained with a single drop of fresh blood. The train finally burst out of the tunnel and back into the morning light. The sudden brightness was blinding. Victor blinked, his eyes stinging, as he looked at the chess piece in his palm. It was an old carving, yellowed with age, but its presence was a clear message. The Red Queen was not just a name in a ledger. She was an active player on this board, and she had just moved her piece. He turned to Dr. Aries, who was now staring at the chess piece with a look of pure terror. "She's here," Aries whispered, his voice cracking. "She didn't wait for the station. She's on the train, Victor." And that was her warning. The discovery of the Ivory Queen transformed the train's atmosphere from a scene of a solved crime into a psychological battlefield. Victor gathered the remaining passengers in the dining car once more. He needed to see their faces in the full light of day. Arthur Henderson sat huddled in his blanket, his eyes darting toward every movement. Sarah was pale, her hands trembling as she adjusted her glasses. Mrs. Gable sat stiffly, her grief now replaced by a cold, sharp-eyed suspicion. Even the staff, James and the young steward, seemed to walk with their shoulders hunched, as if expecting a blow from the shadows. "Someone in this room, or someone very close to us, is working for the woman you call the Red Queen," Victor announced, placing the ivory chess piece on the central table. The white carving looked out of place against the fine linen. "In the tunnel, an attempt was made to take the evidence I found. They failed to get the ledger, but they left this. It is a signature. It tells us that the arrest of Miller was only the beginning." Victor watched their reactions closely. Mrs. Gable's lip curled in a sneer of fear, while Sarah looked like she might faint. Henderson, however, stared at the chess piece with a look of recognition that he quickly tried to hide. "Arthur," Victor said, leaning in. "You've seen this set before, haven't you?" Henderson hesitated, his fingers plucking at the edge of his wool blanket. It belonged to the museum," he admitted finally. The ivory set was part of the collection that disappeared 20 years ago. It was considered the most valuable item because it once belonged to a king. The Red Queen isn't just a title she took. She took the name from the piece she stole. The revelation added a layer of historical weight to the mystery. The woman they were hunting was not just a blackmailer. She was the original architect of the heist that had ruined so many lives. The train began to slow down again, though there was no station in sight. James checked his watch, his face etched with worry. We shouldn't be stopping here. This is the high pass. The tracks are prone to ice, but the engine is running fine. As the Midnight Express came to a grinding halt amidst the towering, snow-covered crags, a soft, melodic chime echoed through the dining car. It was the sound of a music box, coming from the speaker system that usually carried the conductor's announcements. The tune was a haunting, slowed-down version of a lullaby. Everyone froze. The music box played for exactly 10 seconds before a woman's voice, calm and cultured, filled the room. "Mr. Victor," she said, the sound clear and chilling. "You have something that belongs to me. You have 5 minutes to bring the ledger to the rear platform, or I will ensure this train never leaves the mountain." The ultimatum from the speakers left the dining car in a state of paralyzed shock. The Red Queen had bypassed the train's internal communications, showing a level of technical control that made the heavy metal walls feel like paper. Victor stood up, his face set in a grim mask. He knew that giving her the ledger would solve nothing. She would kill them all to ensure her secrets remained buried in the snow. But he also knew he couldn't ignore the threat. He had 5 minutes to turn the tables on a woman who had been outsmarting the world for 2 decades. "James, get me the radio transmitter from the locker," Victor ordered. The conductor scrambled to obey. Victor then turned to Sarah. "I need your help. You're a lawyer. You know how to document evidence quickly. I need you to witness what I'm about to do." He pulled out the ledger and the radio. He wasn't going to the rear platform. He was going to the roof. He knew that the Red Queen must be close, likely in a vehicle or a hidden structure nearby, using a short-range signal to hijack the speakers. If he could broadcast the contents of the ledger over the emergency frequency, her leverage would vanish instantly. Victor climbed the narrow ladder at the end of the carriage, pushing open the heavy hatch. The wind on the high pass was a frozen scythe, cutting through his coat. He crawled across the curved metal roof of the dining car, the snow making the surface treacherously slippery. In the distance, perched on a rocky ledge overlooking the tracks, he saw a dark, sleek shape, a high-powered snowcat with a satellite dish mounted on its roof. A figure in a long red coat stood beside it, watching the train through binoculars. This was her. The Red Queen was not a ghost. She was a predator waiting for her prize. Victor fumbled with the radio, his fingers nearly numb. He tuned it to the international emergency frequency and began to speak, reading the names and the bank account numbers from the ledger. He knew the police at the next station would be listening. Below him, he heard the rear door of the train open. Someone was ignoring his orders and heading to the platform. He looked down and saw Mrs. Gable walking toward the back, a small, silver pistol in her hand. She wasn't going to surrender. She was going to settle a 20-year-old debt. The signal from Victor's radio connected. "This is Victor," he shouted into the wind. "I am broadcasting the contents of the Henderson ledger. To anyone listening, the Red Queen is at coordinates 46.5, 9.8. Send everything you have." The wind on the roof of the Midnight Express was a physical force, a wall of ice that threatened to toss Victor into the abyss below. He lay flat against the cold metal, his fingers trembling as he clutched the radio. The broadcast was live. He could hear the static-filled echo of his own voice as the data from the Henderson ledger surged through the airwaves toward the valley's authorities. On the rocky ledge, the Red Queen had dropped her binoculars. She realized her leverage was disintegrating. To her, the ledger was a list of secrets, but to the world, it was now a warrant for her arrest. She didn't reach for a white flag. Instead, She reached into the back of the snowcat and pulled out a long, sleek rifle case. Victor watched in horror as she assembled the weapon with the practiced ease of a professional. She wasn't aiming for him. Not yet. She aimed the barrel toward the engine of the train. If she could disable the locomotive here, on the high pass, she could pick off the passengers at her leisure or leave them to freeze while she made her escape through the mountain trails. Victor knew he had to distract her, but he was exposed, a dark shape against the white roof. "Stop!" Victor screamed, though his voice was swallowed by the gale. He sat up, waving the ledger in the air. "I have the original." The broadcast is only half the story. It was a lie, but it was the only card he had left to play. The Red Queen paused, the rifle scope shifting from the engine to Victor's chest. For a moment, time seemed to crystallize. The retired detective looked down the barrel of death, seeing the faint glint of the morning sun on the lens. He wasn't afraid for his own life. He was afraid of the silence that would follow if the ledger was destroyed. Just as she began to squeeze the trigger, a sharp report echoed from the rear of the train. It wasn't the sound of a rifle, but a smaller, sharper report, a pistol. Mrs. Gable stood on the rear platform, her silver handgun pointed toward the ledge. She wasn't a sharpshooter, and the distance was too great for a small pistol to be accurate, but the bullets hitting the rocks near the snowcat were enough to spoil the Red Queen's aim. The rifle shot went wide, striking the metal chimney of the dining car. Victor seized the moment, rolling toward the hatch. He had to get back inside. The roof was no longer a place for a detective. It was a shooting gallery. Victor scrambled down the ladder, his feet hitting the carpet of the dining car. He didn't stop to catch his breath. He ran toward the rear platform where Mrs. Gable was still standing, her arm outstretched, the pistol shaking in her hand. Sarah and Henderson were huddled by the door, watching in silent terror. Mrs. Gable's face was transformed. The mask of the mourning widow had shattered, revealing a woman consumed by a cold, burning fire. "Put it down." "Mrs. Gable," Victor shouted, reaching for her shoulder. "You'll only make yourself a target." She killed him. "Victor!" Mrs. Gable shrieked, her voice cracking against the wind. "My husband didn't die of a broken heart or a weak constitution. He was the one who tried to hide the paintings 20 years ago to protect them from her. She poisoned him slowly, month by month, until he was nothing but a shell. I found the vials in her signature red glass. She took everything from me, and now I'm going to take her life." Victor realized the depth of the tragedy. Mr. Gable hadn't been a thief. He had been a guardian who had fallen victim to the Red Queen's long game. Mrs. Gable had boarded the Midnight Express not for a holiday, but for an execution. She fired again, the small pistol kicking in her hand. On the ledge, the Red Queen ducked behind the snowcat, returning fire with the rifle. A bullet shattered the glass of the rear door, showering Sarah and Henderson with shards. "Get inside," Victor commanded, grabbing Mrs. Gable by the waist and pulling her back into the carriage. He slammed the heavy metal door shut and locked it. They were safe for the moment, but the Red Queen wasn't finished. The snowcat's engine roared, and the vehicle began to descend the steep slope toward the tracks. She wasn't fleeing. She was coming to board the train. She knew the high pass was a bottleneck, and she intended to reclaim her ledger and silence the witnesses before the police could arrive. Victor looked at the terrified group. They were no longer just passengers. They were survivors of a 20-year-old war that was reaching its bloody climax. The Midnight Express groaned as the Red Queen's rifle shot to the engine finally took effect. Though the bullet hadn't hit the main boiler, it had severed a high-pressure steam line. The train gave a final, wheezing shudder and came to a dead halt. The silence that followed was more terrifying than the noise. Without the vibration of the engine, the mountain felt impossibly large and hostile. The heating system began to fade immediately, the warmth of the dining car escaping through the shattered rear window. "James, can we fix it?" Victor asked as the conductor ran into the room, his face covered in soot. "Not here, sir," James gasped. The pressure is dropping too fast. We're sitting ducks. And that snowcat, it's almost at the tracks. Victor looked out the side window. The dark, sleek vehicle was sliding down the embankment like a predatory insect. It came to a stop just 10 meters from the storage car. The door of the snowcat opened, and the woman in the red coat stepped out. She wasn't carrying the rifle now. She held a submachine gun, and her movements were calm and deliberate. "She's coming for the ledger," Henderson whispered, his face ashen. "She'll kill us all to get it." "Not if we move," Victor said, his mind racing. "James, is there a manual brake on the last carriage?" "Yes, but why? If we disconnect the engine and the first 3 cars, the incline of the high pass might be enough to let the rear carriages, the dining car and the storage car, roll backward. We can't go forward, but we can go down. There's a siding 5 kilometers back near the old logging camp. If we can reach it, we can barricade ourselves there." It was a desperate plan. Rolling a heavy train carriage backward down a mountain pass without an engine was a suicide mission. But staying still was a death sentence. Victor looked at the Red Queen, who was now walking toward the train. She raised her weapon. "James. Sarah. Help me with the coupling. We have 3 minutes before she reaches the door." As James and Victor struggled with the heavy iron coupling in the freezing gap between the carriages, the truth of the Gable family continued to unravel. Mrs. Gable stood guard at the broken window, her pistol ready, but her voice was strangely calm as she spoke to Sarah. "My husband, Thomas, was the museum's head of security," she said, her breath fogging in the air. "He didn't steal the paintings. He intercepted the theft. But he knew he couldn't trust the police. The Red Queen had already bought them. So he hid the collection on this very train line, inside the hidden compartments he helped design years ago." Victor, straining against the frozen metal pin of the coupling, listened intently. So the paintings hadn't been stolen by Henderson or Aries. They had been saved by Thomas Gable, only to be discovered years later when Henderson's company fell into debt. The Red Queen had spent 20 years searching for the man who had outsmarted her, and once she found him, she had destroyed him. This wasn't just about art. It was about a master criminal who couldn't stand the thought of a single defeat. "Almost there," Victor grunted, hitting the pin with a heavy wrench. With a final, echoing report, the coupling fell away. The dining car and the storage car were now free from the dead weight of the engine. For a second, nothing happened. Then, with a slow, sickening lurch, the floor beneath them began to tilt. The carriages started to move, rolling backward away from the engine and away from the Red Queen. A scream of rage echoed from the tracks. The Red Queen fired a burst from her weapon, the bullets raking the side of the dining car, but the train was already gaining speed. The gravity of the high pass was taking over. They were flying backward into the white void of the mountains, a ghost train with no engine and no lights, carrying a fortune in stolen art and a group of people held together by nothing but fear and the desperate hope of a retired detective. The speed of the 2 carriages increased rapidly as they descended the steep grade. The sound was terrifying, a high-pitched metallic scream as the wheels fought against the iced-over tracks. Inside, Victor and the others held onto the fixed tables. The lack of an engine meant there was no weight to stabilize the cars. They bounced and swayed, threatening to jump the rails at every curve. "The brake!" Victor shouted to James. "We're going too fast. If we hit the curve at the gorge, we'll fly off." James threw his weight against the manual brake wheel at the end of the car. Sparks flew from beneath the floor as the brake shoes gripped the frozen wheels. The smell of burning metal filled the air. The train slowed slightly, but the momentum was still immense. Suddenly, the mountain itself seemed to groan. A deep, bass vibration rumbled through the floorboards, louder than the screeching wheels. "Look!" Sarah pointed out the window. High above the tracks, the vibrations from the Red Queen's gunfire and the screeching brakes had triggered the inevitable. A massive shelf of snow and ice was sliding down the peak. It was an avalanche, a white wall of destruction moving with the speed of a jet. It wasn't hitting the train directly, but it was heading straight for the tracks ahead of them, the very path they were rolling toward. "Brace yourselves," Victor yelled. The avalanche hit the tracks 500 meters below them with the force of a bomb. A cloud of white powder exploded into the air, obscuring everything. The carriages slammed into the edge of the debris pile. The impact was violent. Victor was thrown across the room, hitting the bar. The storage car behind them buckled, its wheels lifting off the tracks before settling deep into the packed snow. Then, silence returned. They were alive, but they were buried. The Midnight Express was now a tomb of ice, and the Red Queen was still somewhere behind them, coming down the mountain. Darkness. The windows were blocked by a wall of solid, packed snow. The only light came from Victor's small flashlight, its beam cutting through the dust and floating particles in the dining car. Everyone was alive, though Sarah had a cut on her forehead and Henderson was dazed. The air was thick and cold, and the silence was absolute. They were buried under at least 3 meters of snow. "We have to dig out," James whispered, his voice trembling. "The air won't last forever in here." "No," Victor said, looking at the ceiling. "The snow is providing insulation. If we dig out now, the Red Queen will see exactly where we are. She has the snowcat. She can traverse the avalanche debris easily. We stay here, in the dark. We use the emergency oxygen masks from the staff cabin if we have to." Victor was thinking like a hunter now. He knew the Red Queen would reach the avalanche site soon. She would see the tracks ending in a wall of white. She would assume they were crushed or buried deep. He moved to the storage car, which was tilted at a precarious angle. The paintings were scattered, their gold frames glinting in the flashlight's beam. He found the ledger in his pocket, damp but intact. He also found something else, a small, emergency flare gun in the storage locker. It wasn't a weapon, but it was a signal. "Everyone, listen," Victor said, gathering them in the center of the car. "We have one advantage. She thinks we're dead or trapped. We're going to wait until we hear her snowcat. When she gets close, she'll have to get out to inspect the wreckage. That's when we move." "Move where?" Mrs. Gable asked, clutching her pistol. "We're going to take her vehicle," Victor said. "It's the only way off this mountain. We're going to lure the Queen into the very trap she built for us." An hour passed. The air in the buried carriage grew thin and sweet. Victor kept his ear pressed against the cold metal of the side wall. Finally, he heard it, the muffled, low-frequency thrum of the snowcat's engine. It stopped directly above them. He heard the boots on the hard-packed snow. The Red Queen was walking on top of their grave. "I know you're down there, Victor," her voice muffled but clear through the metal. "I can see the vent pipe sticking through the snow. You have the ledger, and I have the air. I can wait. Or I can start pouring the extra fuel from my tanks down the vent. What do you think would happen to those priceless paintings if I dropped a single match?" She was clever. She knew they were alive. Victor looked at the group. He saw the fear in Henderson's eyes and the resolve in Mrs. Gable's. He signaled to James and Sarah. They moved to the rear hatch, the one Victor had used to get to the roof earlier. It was now covered by a thin layer of snow. "I'm coming up," Victor shouted. "Don't use the fuel. I'll give you the ledger." He climbed the ladder and pushed the hatch. A shower of snow fell into the car as he broke through to the surface. He pulled himself out into the blinding white light of the high pass. The Red Queen stood 5 meters away, her red coat a vibrant gash against the snow. She held a flare in one hand and her submachine gun in the other. "The book, Victor," she said, her eyes cold. "Throw it over." Victor held up the leather notebook. But he didn't throw it. He looked past her, toward the snowcat. The door was slightly ajar. "You know, for a master criminal, you made one mistake," Victor said. "You forgot that a train isn't just a carriage. It's a team. At that moment, the snow exploded behind her. James and Mrs. Gable burst through a secondary opening they had dug near the storage car. Mrs. Gable didn't hesitate. She fired her pistol into the air to distract the Queen. The Red Queen spun around, her weapon raised. But Victor was already moving. He lunged at her, his weight tackling her into the soft snow. The struggle in the snow was a frantic blur of red and grey. The Red Queen was surprisingly strong, her movements fast and desperate. She managed to kick Victor away and scrambled toward her fallen submachine gun. But before she could reach it, the cold barrel of a pistol pressed against the back of her neck. Mrs. Gable stood over her, the silver gun steady. "End of the line," Mrs. Gable hissed. Victor stood up, brushing the snow from his coat. "Bring her inside," he commanded. "We need to wait for the authorities, and I want the truth before they get here." They descended back into the buried dining car, using the snowcat's winch to pull the hatch clear. The interior was dim, lit by a few surviving emergency lamps. The Red Queen sat in a velvet chair, her hands zip-tied with the conductor's emergency restraints. She looked around the room with a sneer, but her eyes kept returning to the ivory chess piece on the table. "Why?" Victor asked. "You had everything. You had the money from the original heist. You had the power. Why spend 20 years hunting these people?" The Red Queen looked at Arthur Henderson, who was trembling in the corner. "Because he has my soul," she said, her voice dropping to a low, melodic growl. "Inside that ledger isn't just bank accounts. It's the proof that I am the daughter of the man who built this train line. I am the rightful heir to the Henderson fortune. Arthur stole the company from my father while he lay dying, and Thomas Gable helped him cover the tracks." The revelation hit the room like a physical blow. This wasn't just a heist, it was a decades-long family feud. The Red Queen, whose real name was Elena Henderson, had been erased from the family history. She had turned to crime to fund her war against the man she believed had stolen her birthright. "I didn't steal it, Elena," Henderson cried out. "Your father was a gambler. He lost the company in a card game. I bought the debts to keep the trains running. I tried to help you, but you were already obsessed with the paintings." Elena, the Red Queen, laughed, a sound that chilled Victor to the bone. "Help me. You sent Miller to follow me. You made me a ghost. The paintings were my inheritance, the only things my father managed to hide from your lawyers. And Thomas Gable knew. He hid them to keep them from both of us." Victor looked at the Ivory Queen. The game was far more complex than a simple theft. It was a tragedy of greed and legacy. Mrs. Gable looked at Henderson, her eyes narrowing. "Is it true, Arthur? Did you know she was his daughter?" Henderson looked at the floor, his silence a confession. Victor realized that on the Midnight Express, there were no true heroes, only people protecting their versions of the past. But Elena had crossed the line into murder and chaos. "It doesn't matter now," Victor said, his voice heavy with disappointment. "The police have the broadcast. The ledger is evidence. Whatever your reasons. Elena, you turned this train into a graveyard." Suddenly, the radio in the Snowcat, which was still parked above the hatch, crackled to life. It wasn't the police. It was a voice Victor recognized. The night steward Miller had supposedly replaced. "Elena, the backup team is at the bridge. We've cleared the tracks. Where are you?" Elena's eyes lit up. She had a second team. She hadn't been acting alone on the mountain. Victor realized they were still in danger. The avalanche had stopped the train, but it hadn't stopped the conspiracy. "James, get the flare gun," Victor shouted. "We need to signal the police helicopters now." But as James reached for the locker, a shadow moved in the doorway of the dining car. The steward who had been helping them, the young man James had trusted, stood there with a heavy wrench. He wasn't a victim. He was the second asset. He struck James across the head and turned toward Victor. The Red Queen's gambit wasn't over. She had one more piece on the board. The young steward, whose name was Leo, didn't hesitate. He kicked over one of the kerosene heaters they had used to keep warm. The fuel spilled across the red carpet, and within seconds, a wall of orange flame erupted between Victor and the exits. The dry velvet of the chairs and the old wood of the dining car were perfect fuel. "The paintings!" Henderson screamed, reaching for the storage car door. "Forget the paintings. Arthur!" Victor yelled, grabbing him. "We have to get out." The smoke was thick and black, filling the buried carriage. The snow above them was a solid roof, trapping the heat and the fumes. It was becoming an oven. In the chaos, Leo moved to Elena, slicing her restraints with a pocket knife. They vanished into the smoke toward the storage car. "They're going for the art," Sarah coughed, her eyes streaming. "Let them," Victor said, ushering Sarah and Mrs. Gable toward the roof hatch. "The storage car is tilted. The fire will reach the fuel tanks in the undercarriage soon. This whole train is going to blow." They scrambled up the ladder, the heat licking at their heels. Victor pushed the women through the hatch and into the freezing mountain air. He looked back one last time. Through the swirling smoke, he saw Elena and Leo struggling to pull a massive gold-framed painting through the snowcat's winch line. They were obsessed to the very end. The sound of a helicopter's rotor blades finally cut through the air. A massive searchlight swung across the avalanche site, illuminating the smoke pouring from the snow. "Get away from the hatch!" Victor screamed at Sarah and Mrs. Gable, pulling them back toward a rocky outcrop. Seconds later, the Midnight Express lived up to its name one last time. A massive explosion rocked the high pass. The fuel tanks in the storage car ignited, sending a pillar of fire through the snow. The avalanche debris was blown apart as the carriage disintegrated. The stolen art, the ledger, and the secrets of the Henderson family were consumed by the flames. The explosion threw Victor onto his back. He looked up to see the snowcat sliding into the fiery crater where the storage car had been. There was no sign of Elena or Leo. They had gone down with their treasure. The police helicopter hovered overhead, a rope ladder dropping down. Armed officers slid down the line, their boots hitting the snow. They moved with precision, securing the area. Victor sat in the snow, his face blackened by soot, watching the fire burn against the dark sky. It was over. Sarah and Mrs. Gable were being led toward the helicopter. Arthur Henderson sat nearby, his head in his hands. He had lost his company, his collection, and his legacy in a single night. "You did what you could, Victor," a voice said. It was Dr. Aries. He had escaped through a side window before the fire took hold. He stood over Victor, his black gloves ruined, his face showing a strange sense of relief. "The past is gone. It burned up in that carriage." "Not all of it, Doctor," Victor said, reaching into his inner pocket. He pulled out a small, singed piece of paper. It was the list of names. His name was still at the bottom. "Why did they put you on that list, Victor?" Aries asked. "Because they knew I wouldn't stop," Victor said. "They knew that even as a retired man on holiday, I would find the truth. And they were right." He looked at the flaming wreckage. The Midnight Express was a skeleton of twisted metal now. The great mystery of the stolen collection was solved, but the cost had been a train and several lives. Victor felt every one of his years as he stood up, aided by a young police officer. "Let's go home," Victor whispered. 2 days later, Victor stood on the platform of the city's central station. The morning was clear and cold, a sharp contrast to the storm on the high pass. The news of the Midnight Express disaster was on every front page. The Red Queen was presumed dead, though her body hadn't been found in the wreckage. Arthur Henderson was under investigation for financial fraud, and Sarah was busy preparing his defense. James the conductor had survived with a concussion and was being hailed as a hero for helping the passengers. Mrs. Gable had disappeared into the city, her silver pistol never found. Victor looked at the tracks. A new train was being prepared for the mountain route, a modern, sleek machine with no hidden compartments and no velvet curtains. The age of the luxury express was truly over. He felt a hand on his shoulder. It was Sarah. She looked tired, but her eyes were kind. The museum is offering you a reward, Victor, for the information that led to the recovery of the items that didn't burn. They found several pieces in the engine car that Elena hadn't reached. Give it to a charity for retired railway workers, Victor said. I didn't do it for the money. I know, Sarah said. She handed him a small envelope. This was found in the Snowcat's wreckage. It has your name on it. Victor opened the envelope. Inside was a single train ticket. It was a one-way pass for the Midnight Express, dated 20 years ago. On the back, in elegant, red handwriting, were 3 words. Check the clock. Victor walked to the center of the station, where a massive, antique clock hung from the iron rafters. It had been there since the station was built, a silent witness to a million journeys. He looked at the clock's face. It was 12 p.m. He remembered the hidden compartment in his cabin. Cabin 4. He remembered the number 7. He looked at the base of the clock's pedestal. There, carved into the stone, was a small, familiar symbol, the same ivory queen he had seen on the train. He reached into a small gap in the masonry, his fingers finding a hidden lever. With a soft click, a small drawer slid out. Inside was a final ledger. This one was different. It wasn't a list of crimes. It was a list of every person who had ever been helped by Thomas Gable, the orphans he had funded, the workers he had saved, and the art he had quietly returned to smaller museums without seeking fame. Thomas Gable hadn't just been a security guard. He had been the true soul of the Midnight Express. He had used the Red Queen's own network to do good, right under her nose. Victor smiled. The mystery was finally complete. He tucked the ledger under his arm and walked toward the station exit. The sun was warm on his face. He was a retired man, and he was finally going on a real holiday. As he walked away, a woman in a long, dark coat watched him from the shadows of a pillar. She adjusted a red scarf around her neck and turned toward the departing trains. The game was over for Victor, but for some, the journey never truly ends. Victor didn't look back. He had his own ticket now, and for the first time in 20 years, he knew exactly where he was going.